thank you so much for joining us for day one of the Certified Professional in Patient Safety Review course webinar. If you can hear my voice right now, you have connected successfully. Over the next few minutes, we'll be going through a few brief introductions and Zoom instructions before we dive into the content of today's course. This course is being recorded, and the links to access that recording will be shared with you at the conclusion of this webinar, and the recording will be available for 30 days. If this is your first time using Zoom, a Join Audio box may have popped up when you joined today's meeting. We recommend you join using your computer audio. You can change your audio settings using the headphone icon button in the lower left-hand corner. We will also be using the chat function throughout today's call, which we can use to answer your questions and have a discussion. Click the chat button at the bottom of your screen to open the chat in your sidebar. When it opens, make sure you're sending to everyone or to me, your host. Type your message and press enter to send. And we'll also be using polling questions throughout today's course. When the presenter starts the poll, it will appear on your screen. You'll select your answer and then click submit. And if you have any technical questions or concerns, please chat them to me directly, webinar host Chrissy Cronin, and I'll assist you with those one-on-one. This program is approved for 7 credits for physicians, nurses, pharmacists, certified professional in patient safety, human factors in healthcare, age-friendly healthcare, and clinical health equity. And there also is a general certificate that you'll receive. After the completion of this 2-day course, you'll be able to claim credits as well as provide feedback on your experience through the post-program survey, which you can access within the Learning Center of the IHI Education platform, which you use to access today's course. Detailed instructions on how to claim credits are included in the handbook, which was emailed to you this morning. Now let's take a moment to practice using the chat and to get to know each other. Please chat in your name and your location as well as something that you're grateful for in this moment. Send to everyone, and we'll wait a few seconds to see what starts to pop up. Good morning, Susan. And I'll go first. My name is Chrissy. I'm located in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm grateful for the sunshine. It was pretty rainy this morning. Welcome from Montana. I also love this fall weather. Glad everyone's having a good, crisp fall day today. Welcome, Deb. Welcome, Kristen. Hello, Sarah from Delaware. San Diego. Great. I think we're all really enjoying this weather. Good. Thank you so much. And please chime in throughout the webinar. We have a unique opportunity to learn from each other and ask questions of the faculty. It is now my pleasure to welcome today's faculty. John Hertig, founder of Hertig Healthcare Advising and adjacent faculty at Purdue University, who will also be serving as our faculty moderator, and Sherry Herner, medication safety and quality coordinator at Kaiser Permanente. On behalf of IHI, thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over to our moderator, John, to start today's session. Take it away, John.
As always, thanks for the introductions and for being really the oil that keeps this whole machine running. Hi, everyone. So excited to be here. Also thrilled that you have 2 pharmacists as your faculty today, which isn't actually always the case, and really excited about that. We're going to have a great couple 2 days. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items before we continue. And if you go to the next, I have control, don't I, Chrissy? Thank you. So just disclosure, we have no relevant relationships to disclose. Our agenda, the all-important agenda, and we've broken this course up into 2 days. What we'll do today is I'm going to kick it off with culture. Culture is the foundation for everything that we do with regards to patient safety. And then we're going to move into performance improvement, analysis, and monitoring. My colleague Sherry is going to take those, and that'll take us to the end of the day. We'll pick back up tomorrow, same time, with systems thinking, human factors, and design, and then cap it off with safety, risks, and responses. And then we're going to go over those test-taking tips and strategies. I mean, that's the reason you're here, right? Is to get a little bit of a refresher, to learn these different domains, and ultimately be more prepared to take and sit for that CPPS exam. So I have three hopeful expectations or takeaways that I want for you. One is I hope you're smarter at the end of tomorrow than you were when you started today and you feel more prepped and ready to take that exam. Two is we really hope that this is an engaging session. We know that learning virtually can be fatiguing. Hopefully, breaking it into 2 days is helpful, but we want to engage with you. We want your questions. We do have test questions, an ability for you to contribute and to practice as you would for the exam, and so we want as much engagement as possible. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, we are going to respect those breaks. So we may not end each module on that exact time. So as pharmacists, right, we're a little type A. Don't worry, everything's okay. We're going to get through everything on time, but we are going to respect those breaks. So at that 125, no matter where we are, we'll break, and then so on and so forth, because we want you to have the opportunity to rest, recover, recaffeinate, whatever you need. So with that, please, we're going to go to the next slide now that we've covered the agenda. As a course overview, and I won't read this all to you, but the idea is that each section has its own learning objectives. We want to make sure we review those 4 patient safety domains that you'll see on the exam. We want to review those in depth. We're going to evaluate various patient safety scenario examples, and then you're going to be able to really start preparing and assessing your own readiness as we go through a bunch of these practice questions, both throughout each module, but certainly at the end of the day tomorrow too, we've added more test questions because that's feedback that we always get from these courses. Okay, so how are we doing on time? We're a couple minutes early, which is great, and that brings me to culture, really the foundation for everything we do in patient safety, and it's my absolute honor to start us off and go through our first domain, which is culture. So ready? Let's do it. The objectives for this particular session on culture include applying the management of safety culture survey results. We're going to discuss methods for raising awareness of patient safety tools, methods, and culture. Describe the impact of organizational change on a culture of patient safety. Explain how understanding and applying the just culture principles supports accountability within our health systems. Outline considerations for driving culture change, and then finally describe how our patients and our families should be involved in that culture of safety. To kick us off with some definitions, how do you define culture? And there's a variety of different ways that we can define the culture of our organization. It could be people like us do things like this, or what people at all levels of an organization do and say when their commitment to safety is not being scrutinized. It's maybe the way things are done around here. And what makes culture so interesting, but as well as complex, is not only do we have an organizational culture, but we also have microcultures. So you have, say, your overall health system organization culture, but then nursing unit 2A has a microculture. The pharmacy department has a microculture. Nutrition has a microculture. And all these microcultures, although different, hopefully are somewhat aligned with that overarching organizational culture. Culture at that organizational or top level does come and hopefully is set by leadership. And leadership is about empowering other people as a result of your presence, the ability to influence and making sure that your impact continues even though you're not physically present. So you're kind of hardwiring whatever that culture is, and you don't need to be physically in front of someone for that culture to exist. Now, when we talk about an ideal safety culture in this context, there are a few different elements that we need to consider. There's the reporting idea that we want to support reporting because that's how we gather the evidence that we can then use to drive safety strategy and inform us. We want it to be just, and we'll go through some more detail of just culture. We need it to be adaptable, flexible, contain components of high reliability. And again, we'll talk about that later on in this course. And it should be always learning, right? If you're not learning, you're behind. You must always be in this process of continual learning, and that only can exist if we have the data, the evidence from reporting to then learn from. So we're going to want to collect, analyze, and then share safety information. That comes from typically our error reporting and feedback loops. Our front line is where oftentimes we're gathering so much of that error data, and they need to have that sensitivity to errors. So often, only the real harmful errors get reported, but we need to learn from all errors, because those near misses, those things that we caught that didn't reach the patient, those are the absolute best little nuggets of information, because not only did a patient not get harmed, but now we have an opportunity to learn and improve our system. That then feeds into this fair and just response to errors. We're not just going to punish people for their mistakes. We always need to revise and review and restructure, and it needs to have that flexibility when necessary to defer to expertise. This kind of flattens the hierarchy, right? It softens what's called softening the authority gradient, where we feel comfortable no matter who we are to speak up and make sure that we're speaking up in the name of safety and ensuring that patient has continual access to safe and effective care. And then finally, that willingness and openness to learn from others, right? You need to be open to learning. Learning is how we grow, it's how we get better. And ultimately, the patient is at the center of all of this ideal safety culture. As I mentioned, we need to be able to gather accurate information. And that starts with assessing that culture of safety. How safe are we? How close to the ideal have we become? So oftentimes we assess a safety culture by administering surveys. And I know I hear the groans even through the Zoom, is we are over surveyed. We are objectively over surveyed. And so as patient safety professionals, it's important that we're thoughtful about how often and who we administer our surveys to ensure that the data received back is reflective of that environment, that we have high response rates, that we have high engagement. So in order to assess that culture with a survey, we're going to define that leadership strategy and then structure how surveys are used. Who are we going to survey? And it can't be the same people every 6 months, because they're going to get survey burnout. How will then results be disseminated across areas? If I'm being surveyed, I want that feedback loop to know how my data is then being used. I want to see it. I don't want it to just go into a dark hole. How will the experts be supported in interpreting those results in a meaningful way? What then is expected of each area? And it can be clinical area, but also non-clinical areas, because safety culture is really pervasive throughout an institution. What additional support is then needed, particularly for some of those low performing departments that really need that additional assistance? And again, not focusing on punishment, saying, okay, the lowest performing department are all getting demotions. It's more of how do we then rise the tide, lifting all boats up? There are many different survey instruments that we can choose. We have the AHRQ instrument, SAQ instrument, Gallup, Prescaney. There are so many out there. That's going to be an organizational decision on how exactly and what you use as your survey instrument, but you need to have a good and deep understanding of the methods used to survey. What's the timing? How are we distributing it? What are the follow-ups like? How do we communicate it? And then for those that are deeply involved in survey administration, there may need to be some additional advanced training. And that then brings me to responding to the actual results. As I mentioned, you need to have or hope to have a valid survey response. Typically, we want engagement of over 60% of a population to determine that it's valid. Hopefully, you have local champions to help manage that survey fatigue and boost those response rates. We'll engage with analytics, and there's plenty of different software programs and methods to interpret results. But I think the most important thing is the analytics, but then those analytics and the results out of the analytics then transitioning to an actual action plan. So what do we actually then do in practice with the data that we've received from the surveys, and then that response plan as well? As I've mentioned, we're going to want to support low performing domains and identify areas of improvement, and then also identify and disseminate best practices from those high performing work units. All too often, I think so many of us get trapped in only focusing on the lower performing units or areas. And so we focus all of our effort on those because we want to bring them up, rightfully so. But remember, there are huge nuggets of opportunity with our high performing units, because we also want to reward and congratulate our high performing units and then replicate the activities the methods, the processes of those high performing units, and then make that the standard. So now we can then replicate those high performing units and spread that throughout our organization. That's about that spread and sustainability. Culture, is it local or organizational? And guess what? I think I gave the spoiler to this earlier. It's both, right? There's the culture of the organization, but then culture is also local. Sexton and colleagues, point to the value of unit level or local culture as it focuses on evaluation and action, because that's really where the work is done. And you'll see that there's quite a bit of variability amongst work units, even within the same hospital. Which makes sense. And if you've worked in healthcare, which I'm sure all of you have, you know that these cultures, these microcultures, are different in different parts of the hospital, despite maybe a unified set of values or organizational culture statement. There's also variability at a role level. Physicians, interestingly enough, and maybe non surprisingly, rate collaboration and communication with nurses very differently than nurses. What that means is physicians typically, if they ask, hey, how's the collaboration with you and your nurse team? The physicians are like, it's great. And then you ask the nurses the exact same question about collaboration with physicians, and they may not respond that it's great. And so there's that variability at the role level. And that's when we get into this idea of teamwork, communication, particularly when it comes to major incidences like sentinel events as defined by the Joint Commission. And so we're going to talk a little bit about teamwork as well. But there's this idea that it's a constant relationship between culture and climate. And Susan, I completely agree. Thank you for your comment. Each shift even has its own microculture within the same department. So you might even be on the same unit, and you have the evening shift versus the day shift that have their own way of doing things in culture. So that's a really good call out. I appreciate that. So there are a variety of different ways that we can assess patient safety culture. I've talked about the culture surveys, which is definitely one of the primary ones, but there are others as well. One of the items that particularly we look at in terms of errors is this idea of voluntary and near miss reporting. So high levels of near miss and error reporting suggest that the culture is comfortable and advanced enough, particularly at the front line, to understand, number one, what constitutes an error, but also knows enough that I need to report it. So that's why we have these programs, good catch reports, bravo, we want you to report. What's interesting, though, about this, and I've been at organizations that have completely mishandled error reporting and have used voluntary error reporting as their only metric of safety. And so you probably can follow me that if you use voluntary error reporting as your only metric of safety culture, you can get into trouble pretty quickly, because what you see is that actually the better you're doing in culture, you will likely have a spike in error reporting, because you have now a culture that supports good error reporting. But if you only use that in isolation, what are you going to see? Oh my gosh, we've invested all this time and energy into safety culture, and our errors have just gotten worse. And so it's a little counterintuitive if you use that as the only metric of safety. And that's why you need these other measures, these balancing measures. Favorable trends do suggest good cultures in place. The leadership needs to understand, though, that those error rate reporting might go up, the better we do, at least in the near term. Leaders do need to be actively involved, and sometimes need to be helped in interpreting that data. We also always evaluate new rules, standard operating procedures. Are we compliant with processes? And we're going to talk a little bit about that later in this course as well. All right. Hopefully you're sticking with me. Let's continue on to education and engagement as it relates to culture. So we always want to raise awareness through engagement and education. You've likely been a part of these engagement and education initiatives at your own facility. So we want to make sure that we have broad engagement in team patient safety initiatives. This is not just the responsibility of the patient safety officer. It's not just the responsibility of the medication safety officer. This is everybody's responsibility, and it needs to be an organizational value. It's very interesting that when we look at, say, our organizational mission, vision, our value statements, there are plenty of organizations that maybe don't include safety in there. And that's a little tough, because if you don't explicitly value that or call out safety, then it might be a little more difficult than to rally around safety. So being thoughtful around how safety is included in some of those key statements for organization is very important. We also want to make sure that our principles and science of patient safety are included in practice, in action. And we have a few that we're going to go through, including standardization, checklists, human factors. There's a whole module or domain on human factors. I'm going to give that one tomorrow. So teaser, something to look forward to. I love human factors, as well as teamwork training. We're going to continue to talk about error reporting and near misses, as well as some standardized error disclosure and apology methods as well. So here are some of the patient safety principles that are hallmarks of ideal patient safety culture: standardization, checklists, event reporting, human factors analysis and assessment, teamwork training, disclosure, and then those cultural influences, including health literacy, which is much different than educational literacy. So let's go through a few of these in a little bit more detail. We're likely all familiar with the principle of standardization. Standardization is a good thing. We want to try to standardize as much as possible. This helps reduce errors within departments as well as across organizations, and then even throughout an entire industry, say in the United States. And one of the best examples of that are color coded wristbands. And you may be familiar with this story. It came out of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Safety Authority. But in this particular real example, what had happened was there was a nurse, a traveling nurse, and this is not uncommon, who traveled between different health systems, between different organizations. At one health system that this individual was used to working at, the yellow wristband meant allergy. So allergy. And so she, it was a female in this case, was used to, if a patient had an allergy, that she would put on a yellow wristband. Well, it just so happened that this traveling nurse went to a different hospital and health system. At that different hospital and health system, yellow meant DNR, do not resuscitate. And so she was taking care of a patient, noted in her chart that she had an allergy to a particular medication, and as she thought was typical of color, she put on a yellow wristband. Unknowingly in that organization, that meant DNR. As so often happens in these examples, the stars align, the pieces of Swiss cheese are perfectly lined up, and that patient coded. So now you have a patient coding, undergoing cardiac arrest. You have a DNR wristband, and so initially in this case, resuscitative efforts were not performed. Bad, very bad, until actually it was a medical resident, I believe, who was reviewing the chart and noticed that she was not DNR. And they actually performed life-saving measures, and unfortunately, in this case, that patient was resuscitated and saved. But you can see how these pieces line up, especially when we're dealing with non-standard training, colors, items, whatever it is, processes. And so this actually led to this somewhat industry-wide standard of colored wristbands and what they actually mean. We also see this in anesthesia medication color coding with regards to paralytics and other medications. That standardization can be really helpful when we're trying to minimize the potential for wrong action or unknown wrong action. Now, although standardization is really good and encouraged, not everything can or should be standardized. Or maybe what you're doing is, if you have 8 different ways of doing it, you can't get it to one standard, but perhaps you can get it down to 2 different standards. So it's standardization ish, right? And I have a good example of this one as well. It was one of my first major faux pas as a patient safety leader. I was fresh out of training, and I was at this hospital, and they put me in charge of an improvement project to standardize medication carts. So if you're unfamiliar, the medication carts are the carts that contain medication, oftentimes at a patient's bedside, or maybe one cart per a few different rooms. And they're typically laid out in a way where nurses can find stuff quickly. And so they need or should be standardized. In this particular hospital, those medication carts were not standardized. So depending on which unit or which floor or what area you were on, the layout of those medication carts was different. And you can easily see how in a hurry or in a crisis, you're used to grabbing something in a place and it's not there and you grab something else, that can be an issue. So I was in charge of standardizing these medication carts. So I'm going by the book. I'm super confident. You may be overconfident, right? At this point, I'm bringing the right people together to the meeting. I got the nurses, I got the pharmacists, I got the physicians, I got the risk managers. We come up, we go through every single by the book improvement step, and I'm ready to roll out this new one standard cart. And it's rolling out on a Monday morning. I'm walking into work, whistling 8 a.m. At 8:02, I get a call from one of my critical care nurse managers, who's a very pleasant person. This morning, this person was not happy. She was expressing herself very transparently to me on the phone about how frustrated she was. And once I was able to figure this out, what I understood happened was we had included internal medicine nurses on this improvement project, but not critical care nurses or procedural area nurses. And so, because of that, we created a MedCart standard that was much more focused on internal or general medicine, where much more of the patients can take oral solids who don't need as many IVs. Well, in our critical care units or our procedural areas, they typically can't swallow, so they need only IVs. And so I essentially rolled out this med card to an area that it was completely unusable, organizationally disaster, had to go back to the drawing board, reconvene, and what we ended up doing is creating two standards. We created like a critical care procedural area standard and then a general medicine standard. So lesson learned, right? Making sure we have the right people in the meetings, but also not everything can or should be standardized just to one standard. All right. The next major principle is checklists. I love checklists. If you're like me, I just love checklists. I'm very fortunate that one of my hobbies is I'm a private pilot, and so I'm using checklists all the time. Checklists were medication safety, patient safety practice borrowed from aviation and other high reliability, high risk industries. There's a great book by Atul Gawande called The Checklist Manifesto, which is an excellent read. And the idea being that we need to standardize tasks, particularly potentially in order, to ensure that the right things are done every single time. Just like a pilot needs a pre-flight checklist or a takeoff checklist, we in healthcare, we also need our checklists. Now, this isn't cookbook medicine. What it is it's making sure the basics are done correctly. So if there's an issue or an urgent need, that we're freeing up our mind and our cognitive ability to take care of the patient in that issue. Just like in a aviation example, if there's an issue on takeoff, they don't need to rethink like, oh, did we do the flaps? No, you did that because you did the checklist. Just fly the plane. In healthcare, do the basics. That way we can then take care of the patients. So these are the list of those actions that are performed to then optimize patient outcomes. They have a history of success. They really help us as a cognitive aid. But implementation of checklists has been varied because even though they work, implementation of them and use of them isn't always 100%. And so caveats to their use is more based on how do we implement them, and we can't just use them in place of training, and we can't use them in place of higher level cognitive thinking. And thank you for the original article and summary of the book. That's excellent. I appreciate that. Atul Gawande was a good writer for the New Yorker. He wrote some great, really interesting models. He compared healthcare to the Cheesecake Factory, and there's lots of really good reading if you're kind of a patient safety nerd like me. So let's pause here, give me a moment to breathe, as well as get your reflections. So consider how you would respond if one of your team members just refused to use a checklist. We know that it's evidence-based. We know it's used to keep safety for our patient. Consider how you would respond if someone just refused to use it. One, have you ever encountered resistance in using checklists? And if you have, what steps did you address to take it? Let's just take a minute, reflect on this. If you do have experiences like this, drop your experience in the chat just so that everyone can learn from each other. Now, why do I need to do this? Why? I'm already busy enough. Thank you. Anyone else? Yep, too much time. Hear that one a lot. Oh, this is great. I love the engagement. Yeah, now we're seeing some steps. Partner with leadership, feedback about it. This is excellent. We got a bunch of pros in the course this time. Pause for any other final thoughts here before we keep going. Oh, we're always changing things. Yeah, because if we're always changing things, people get a little reluctant to do more. And do we have the right questions? Yeah, in terms of buy-in, how was it developed, right? Generally, people like to be a part of the process, and then it's easier for them to adopt it if they've been part of it. That's great. Yeah, maybe it's a one-off. Check with others, get their reasons. Very good. Yeah, that is an issue. People just check the box to check the box. There's I could tell stories all the time, but there's a really famous air disaster. It was a Delta plane, and this was back in the 80s, 90s, and you can hear on the audio that they were configuring the plane for takeoff, and they were distracted, and the flight attendant was in there, and they were going through the checklist, and you can hear 3 green, meaning everything was set and ready to go. But they didn't actually. They just checked it. They didn't actually check that it was 3 green. They were so used to going through the checklist, rather than actually do it, they just said 3 green. It wasn't configured properly. There was a major accident with lots of death. So this is, unfortunately, it does happen where if you're not using these appropriately, you can have some significant issues. All right, let's move on. Thank you. Excited to keep that engagement continuing. We've already mentioned event reporting and near misses. This is really vital because this is how we learn. This is how we learn. And we need to educate our staff on providing a clear expectation of what and how to report, not just those significant harm events, but really everything, including near misses. We're not just blaming people, saying, well, hey, this error occurred because John really screwed it up and Sherry trained John and Sherry doesn't know what she's doing. Let's keep it objective, keep it fact based. Right? Review these types of reports routinely with staff, creating that feedback loop. You may not be able to go through every report back with the staff, but what you can do is collate reports and say, we've received a lot of reports like this from you all. We've categorized them, we've take this appropriate action, and then we're telling you about that action so that we know that your reporting is making a difference and not just going into a black hole. And that leads to the why. What has been learned from the reporting, and then always use storytelling. The best and most effective method when it comes to communication, in my experience, is that storytelling piece. Probably no surprise to you all right now on the webinar. Storytelling, but then backing it up with concrete evidence. So, this happened to this little girl. This is what happened. Oh, but also there's 100 of other people just like her. And here's the evidence base. So it's that storytelling plus the evidence to back it up. This relates to learning from events. So events are opportunities. We can't improve without learning. Near misses are gifts. There's going to be a immediate action, but also we'll likely go through maybe a root cause analysis, particularly if harm was involved. And we're going to dive into RCAs, root cause analyses, in more detail later on. We often want to aggregate our data to find those common causes rather than the one-offs. We need to have the structures and resources in place to support resolution as well as improvement efforts, especially when we have those demonstrable trends. And then we're sharing learning. We're always sharing learning. The worst thing in medication and patient safety is if another unit or another area of our hospital learned something, but it wasn't shared in a different part of the hospital, and another harm occurred. That's the worst. Or even hospital to hospital. We need to be sharing not only within our hospitals, but also between our hospitals and health systems. We're going to have a whole domain on human factors. So I'm just going to briefly introduce it now. The science of human factors is, quote, the study of the interrelationship between humans, the tools and equipments they use in the workplace, and the environments in which they work. This is different than human error, and we will go through this in more detail tomorrow. Teamwork makes the dream work. Healthcare is a team sport, and teamwork is absolutely essential. I can't tell you how many root cause analyses or how many Joint Commission Sentinel event alerts cite poor teamwork as the root cause for errors. This can be broken down into a variety of different elements. Most importantly, team structure. Who's on the team? Got to have the right people on the bus. Who's leading that team? How are we communicating between team members and then externally to the team or to other teams? How do we monitor situations that come up within those teams and have the flexibility and adaptability to pivot when needed? We're coordinated in that way, and that we're supporting each other. We're all on the same team, right? We shouldn't be fighting against each other. And these are those elements that result in high performing teams. Now, this doesn't just happen. It's not magic. You don't put a bunch of people in a room and say, okay, you're a great team now. It does require an iterative approach and good team training. And the main thrust here is collaboration, communication, coordination. It's those three C's: collaboration, communication, coordination. Human mental processing deficits support the need for strong teamwork, meaning we can't do it alone. We all have different skill sets. We all have different experiences, training, framework, ways of processing. And so what we do is we back each other up. And what that does is then help us individually minimize slips, lapses, and mistakes when I have a team backing me up. So how do we reduce these methods? Simulation is a great way, and it can be low fidelity simulation where we're doing more pretending, or it can be really high fidelity simulation when we have, say, the mannequin and we're in a real environment that's simulating reality. We can use different models, including CRM, which is crew resource management, which was adapted from aviation. Back in the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s, when there was a significant uptick in aviation accidents, they realized there was a need for better communication in the cockpit. And so it actually started out as cockpit resource management, but as it extended to air traffic control, other members of the crew, was then evolved into crew resource management, and that's obviously what we use today. And then modeling, it could be simulated modeling, role modeling, training in that way is another great way to model for teams. You don't need to memorize this. This is just an example of a project plan of how we would move from pre-implementation activities to implementation to driving culture change. So what is then teaming in healthcare? What is teaming in healthcare? As you're well aware, teams are not always static groups of people who have practiced their skills together for a long time. It's not like you're an NCAA championship basketball team. You're always practicing every day, all together. You know each other's every move and instinct. No, sometimes you're thrown together, just for a day or just for a particular project or just for a shift. So sometimes they are fluid groups of people who have just met and don't have that long relationship. That said, despite that, you use the same elements of teamwork, but share critical knowledge quickly, meaning that communication needs to ramp way up. Because if you're not used to how each other operate, then you need to make sure that you find a way to commonly communicate, asking questions, oversharing, and making sure that your frequency of communication is enhanced or heightened. Let's move on to another principle. And this is one of the items no one wants to talk about, which is error disclosure and dealing with unexpected outcomes. One is you should have hopefully a policy, procedure, something in place in your organization that outlines effective disclosure. You're going to want to partner with the leaders in both safety as well as risk management in your organization. You need to understand what local or regional laws may affect disclosure. Each state may have different error disclosure laws. Identify what needs to be disclosed, and remember, the goal is to inform the patient and family so that they can make appropriate care decisions. I will say, even before this, rule like zero is take care of the patient. So if there's an error or harm, the first thing you do is stabilize the patient, do whatever you need to make sure that that patient is stable and okay given the circumstances. The next thing you do is transparency, is disclosure that an error occurred. Now, here's the thing: you can disclose that an error occurred, but you're likely not going to have all the information initially in order to give a detailed analysis. So don't suppose, don't be subjective, don't make stuff up. Be transparent, and then display empathy, and also say, we will follow up with you as we have more information. We will be investigating this. And this takes training, this takes simulation, it takes rehearsal, and it also would benefit from the inclusion of patient and family advisory committee assistants, because if we're dealing with patients when we're disclosing, then we should have patient representation on those types of committees to help set the policies and procedures related to disclosure. Nothing about us without us. I love that. That is perfect. And that applies to so much, not only in disclosure, but also in healthcare transformation, improvement projects. If it's going to impact someone, they need to have some representation or a seat at the table. Thank you for sharing that. Cultural influences within healthcare are increasingly significant. They've always been significant, but this only grows in significance. And in tandem, this connection to health literacy. You can be a literate person, a very highly educated, literate person, but you could have low health literacy, because health literacy relates to how we navigate a very complex health system. So don't assume that because someone's educated that they have high health literacy. So when we look at these cultural influences, I love this image, and this is a great graphic, Susan. Thank you. Where you have this cultural iceberg, and as we know about icebergs, the majority of it is below the surface where you can't see. So above the surface in the cultural iceberg are those observable behaviors, the things we see. But remember, underneath are a lot more things. These are the not observable. These include interpretations of how we feel about core values. And at the very bottom are those core values. And those core values are core. They're very strong. They're very rigid. They're learned ideas over the course of a lifetime of what is considered good or bad, right or wrong. And this can include education impacts, the media. Oh my gosh, let's not even get into that, right? History, religion, family, economic situation, individual events that have happened to you. Those all form core values that then get interpreted. That's all non observable as we work with each other. And so it's important to understand that, not only in our teammates, but also in the patients that we take care of. And so those individual values, language, background, all impact how we deliver safe care. Back to health literacy, a lack of health literacy or lower health literacy leads to higher readmissions, the inability to follow treatment plans, inability to navigate a very complex healthcare system, increased healthcare costs to all of us, not just the patient, limitations in the preventative medicine, which we know is so effective, and then just self-reported poor health. So what we need to do is recognize that, and then develop tools that help combat lower health literacy, and consider all the while considering the cultural influences of the staff and our patients. And all this is really leading up to change, because we can't positively change our healthcare system. We can't make it more safe without these foundational cultural considerations. And as we reflect on change, then we got to be thinking about, what are we going to change? What effects will that change have? What balancing measures will we measure? And those balancing measures, remember, that's those measures that we include to ensure, as we're trying to change something else, we don't break something else over here. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next domain. Sherry will be talking about those. And then what's our ROI? What's our return on investment? And we do have to think about money sometimes in healthcare. No margin, no mission. There are some investments we make in healthcare with regards to safety that don't make money back, but there are others that may. And so we'll talk a little bit later about ROI and how we calculate ROI. All right. Oh, this is great. We're over halfway or about halfway done with this module. And now we're going to get on to promoting a culture of safety through just culture and accountability. So we're going to be talking about just culture and accountability here in this next section. Thank you for the dialogue I'm seeing in the chat. I love that you're not only asking questions of us, but also of each other. And that's how this should be. We're a learning community here online. So let's talk about just culture. And what it boils down to is this idea of psychological safety. And psychological safety simply is that I, in my environment that I'm in, feel safe to bring up concerns. I feel safe to ask questions and bring up concerns. And so, psychological safety, as you can imagine, is essential to good, safe culture because if I don't feel safe and I'm not going to bring up concerns, then that increases the likelihood something wrong will happen. So, this is when staff feel comfortable asking questions, sharing concerns, admitting mistakes, requesting help, raising dissenting views. This is not being combative, but you can be dissenting without being combative. And you do that without the fear of being humiliated, blamed, ignored, or even worse, punished, right? So, it's critical to a learning environment and a safe culture that we have psychological safety that enables individuals to willingly contribute. Because if we are trying to create a team where everyone's maximizing their value, we want to make sure everyone's feeling psychologically safe to then maximize their value. It does then require active work to create. Messaging the importance of everyone's input, asking open-ended questions, and this is really where role modeling is essential. Our leaders need to role model this. Our physician leaders need to role model this. Our safety leaders, our quality leaders, everyone needs to be role modeling this idea of being okay to ask and create that psychological safety. So how do we then do this and respond to adverse events? Because adverse events do occur. And it's important to remember that as a patient safety professional, your goal is not to reduce errors or eliminate errors. Excuse me. Your goal is not to eliminate errors. Your goal is to eliminate harm. There should be no harm. Zero harm is the goal. That's like a black and white patient safety statement. It's true, errors lead to harm. But as long as we as humans, and humans are fallible, we're imperfect, so as long as we're involved in healthcare, there will be errors. So please don't make your goal eliminate all errors. Your goal is eliminate all harm. This then links back to how we respond to adverse events. And remember, the single greatest impediment that we have to error prevention is that we punish people for making mistakes. Because if we punish people for making honest mistakes, because humans are fallible, then what are you going to do in response to a mistake? If you know you're going to get punished, what are you going to do? You're going to hide it. You're going to sweep it under the rug. You're going to try to blame someone else. And that's not how we learn and grow. And so we need to be incentivizing a more positive response to honest mistakes. And that's where just culture comes in. And we've kind of ridden a roller coaster here to where we are in just culture. We're coming from a blame culture where if someone did something wrong, we blame them, we punish them. It was an eye for an eye. We recognize that that wasn't helping us improve. And so then as a culture in healthcare, we kind of moved to a blameless culture. This is when we were like, oh yeah, you don't want to blame people. And so now we're all the way over to the other end of the spectrum. Now we blame nobody. You know, you operate on the wrong leg. It happens, bummer, but you'll get the next one. No, we don't want a totally blameless culture either. There needs to be accountability. And so there needs to be this match of let's make sure we're learning from honest mistakes, but we're also keeping it accountable at the same time. And that's where just culture strives to create that balance between individual accountability and systems accountability. Sometimes it's the systems that are at fault, not the person. Some key points as we look at just culture. One is it's tied to event review processes. There's an algorithm that has been used with this. It focuses on individual choices, not the outcome. There's a gosh, there's a legal term. I believe it's called moral luck. And I know this isn't a law class, but I think it's relevant. Is moral luck surrounds this idea where, okay, you're late for a meeting, you speed through a red light, nothing happens. There's no police officer there, there's no one there, you just speed through it. Okay. Same situation, you speed through a red light, but this time you hit someone in the crosswalk. You're going to be punished for the outcome. You're going to be punished for hitting a person. You're not punished for the choice you made, because in both situations, the choices were the same. And this is the idea of moral luck. And this is also tied to the idea of just culture is we need to focus on the choices, not the outcome. Unfortunately, it's not always black or white. And that's why oftentimes we use a group approach to make these types of assessments. This is a really nice graphic that I think well articulates just culture, where we have two different factors. On the top, we have intentionality. So on the left, we have low intention. On the right, we have high intention. On the bottom, we have the accountability. Left, we have low accountability. On the right, we have high accountability. And so the top is the choices. What intentional choice did you make? On the bottom is how accountable should you be? And so on the left, we have low intention, meaning I had no intention to do this. And so the accountability would likely be lower. These are those completely unconscious mistakes, slips, lapses, human errors because we're human. In the middle is going to be our gray zone. That's our risky behavior, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail here in the coming slides. And then on the right are fortunately more of the rare events in healthcare. This is when I go into work and I intentionally try to harm somebody. That is very rare. Most of what we're dealing with in patient safety is to the left of that, is the completely unconscious and the risky behavior. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail here. So basic human error. Just culture, fortunately, accepts us for who we are as humans, that we are fallible. To err is human, right? Fallibility is a part of human nature, while error is inevitable, harm is not. That goes back to my point, is as patient safety professionals, our goal is zero harm. We can't always have zero error. What we do is design systems that create barriers, recoveries, redundancies to then minimize harm and hopefully reduce it to zero. So catch those errors before they translate. We share stories, we communicate, we have improvements in team training, we incorporate principles of human factor design. On the other end of that spectrum, as I said, are those purposeful acts. This is fortunately very rare. These are 100% punishable, sanctional, requires organizational oversight, and you need to have a policy to act on that appropriately. But really, the nuance here is in that risky behavior zone. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of us end up when we're doing these patient safety reviews. Some questions to ask ourselves as we review risky behavior. Was the risk itself not recognized? Or was it mistakenly believed to be justified? So did you know that there was a risk, but you thought it was justified based on your action? Or was it known but just disregarded? So, if you mistakenly believed it was justified because you were trying to get to the patient quicker, and so you didn't barcode scan because there was an urgent situation, and you thought you need to get that patient that medication quicker, and so you skipped the barcode scanning process, that might have been mistakenly believed to be justified. Or alternatively, did you use a smart pump, and rather than use the feature to bolus or give a patient more, you just dialed up that smart pump to 999 rate and let it run and then forgot about it? So you knew it, you just disregarded it. And the way we handle this in just culture is a little different. So when we think about when to apply accountability, and going back to these three buckets of types of error, types of harm, in just culture, we have on one end that human error where it's inadvertent, unplanned. You need to identify the system issues. So that's more system focused. In that case, we much more focus on supporting the staff member that caused the error, especially if there was harm, because that was a system level issue. On risky behavior, it's typically actions of individuals who either should have been aware of a risk but not, or were aware of the risk and consciously chose to disregard it. In this area, there may be support, there may be some action or accountability taken. And then on purposeful harm, that's a conscious decision to harm somebody. That is a black and white. There needs to be accountability and punishment as a result. To help us determine, where our teammates are, where our colleagues are on the accountability system, there are lots of different models we can use. This is one sample model. It's called the PARS process. What I like about this is it's a stepwise approach to elevate the accountability. So it starts at the bottom with single unprofessional incidents. It then moves to, oh, now it's not just a single incident. There's now a pattern of this person doing things that are risky. That pattern then persists, and then there's no change. And the way that you then respond to that is going to be different. So when it's a single unprofessional incident where it was just a bad choice, that's when we like to say, have an informal cup of coffee conversation. So say a physician didn't do a sponge count at the end of a procedure because they were busy and ran off to do something else. And they did it once. That's when you have another surgeon or another physician sit them down for a cup of coffee and be like, look, you can't do that. That's not standard of care. We can't see that happen again. And then you can see this elevates as it moves on. So as those maybe patterns persist, we then go through level one, level two, and then finally disciplinary action. We're not going straight to that punitive approach. Particularly when there's that unknown, innocent human error, that's when we really need to focus on support for our team members, particularly in incidences of significant harm. This is that concept of care of the caregiver. This is formally known as the second victim. I mean, first victim is the patient and their families, first victim. Then we think about how do we support each other. This can result in a lot of grief and a lot of mental health issues, personally, from insomnia, decreased appetite, blame, depression, home issues, substance abuse, and in severe cases has resulted in suicide. The guilt is overwhelming for these caregivers. Professional, you could have self-confidence issues, concentration issues, burnout. You may just leave the profession entirely. You just can't do it anymore. It is estimated that between 10 and 50% of healthcare professionals experience some type of patient safety incident. And no surprise, we're not perfect. We are humans, and so errors will occur. Okay. Can anyone expand on egregious and mandated on the PARS system? Let's go back to that slide just because I want to make sure we're really clear. I think we have a moment. The mandated reviews. So if it's okay, I understand. Yeah. So not everything will follow this cascade. I mean, this is typical that we would start at the bottom of the pyramid and move up. But if there's a single unprofessional incident that is so egregious, you may skip straight to disciplinary action. So let me give you an example. You come to work drunk or high, and you make a mistake. Like that is egregious enough where you're going to go straight to discipline. Even if it happened one time, you're not going to have a colleague come and sit you down for a cup of coffee and say, you know what, don't do 3 shots of tequila before work. Right? So that would be an example of that egregious. Hopefully that's helpful. Yeah, a surgeon in Boston once left the OR with a patient on the table to go to the bank. A great example. I think that would maybe be on the egregious end of that. You really do know better. Okay. So we got about 20-25 minutes left in this module. I want to make sure we get to our practice questions at the end. We're getting near the end here, so let's dive into organizational leadership. As I've mentioned several times, organizational leadership does set the tone for creating and maintaining a culture of safety. It starts at the top and it needs to be hammered home every single time. I did mention that leaders are essential in modeling psychological safety and flattening that authority gradient when it comes to safe communication. This then reinforces just culture. We're going to hold each other accountable, model and demonstrate those principles of high reliability. We'll talk more about high reliability and high reliability organizations in the human factors domain tomorrow. And then making sure that we're doing nothing about me, that safety improvements have the input of our frontline staff who actually have to do that work. It is our leaders' responsibility to continually assess and improve safety culture. It is so closely tied to strategy. So engage patient advisory members and councils in our work, learn from other team members across the care continuum, and then always be sharing stories of lesson learned. We want to make sure that we're spreading and sustaining that improvement. That ties back to leadership strategy and making it a priority. This is why in so many of our leadership meetings, I love when we start with a call to purpose and we start with safety as item number one on the agenda. That's setting a tone not only for that meeting, but for the leaders who are running those types of meetings as well. In terms of individual and team leadership to help support safety culture, as individuals, what we can do? Well, we can respect each other. I mean, I think that's pretty basic, right? Is respect each other, communicate clearly. There are great tools that we can use to communicate, like SBAR, situation, background assessment, and recommendation, report, and then model. As a team, we can work together to establish a fair and just culture that balances accountability with just the fact that we're humans and we will make mistakes, flattening the hierarchy, softening the authority gradient, enhancing psychological safety, act upon safety concerns, take them seriously, and then create that feedback loop so that if I, as a frontline practitioner or a frontline staff member, if I'm taking time out of my valuable day to report something, that I know that report is being used to improve care and that feeds back to me. And then certainly holding each other accountable. Those cuss words, the acronym is, I'm blanking on the acronym right now, but cuss words aren't cuss words like we would think in terms of swear words, but it's an acronym stand for I'm concerned. Thank you. Concerned, uncomfortable, and safe. Thank you. Thank you. I see. This is why we're a learning community. So it stands for concerned. So if you're concerned with something, you're going to elevate it. So initially, I'm concerned that you're doing this. I'm uncomfortable you're doing this. And then this is a safety issue we have to stop. So it's a way to elevate your language. And thank you for backing me up. See, slips and lapses, you got me covered. So thank you for that. Community group leadership and outreach. We want that shared leadership among several groups. I think we've talked about this, is we certainly don't want to repeat mistakes even within our own health system and also between health systems. So if we can share and create a community in our local region where we're sharing that, that's really helpful. Engaging community leaders, educational systems leaders, and our social safety networks. So in summary, as we draw the first domain of culture to a close, remember, developing and sustaining a positive safety culture is really the shared responsibility of leadership and our frontline team members and everyone in between. It's all of us on the same team. A just culture is one that holds individuals accountable for their actions, but not for faulty systems. Not for faulty systems. If someone made an honest mistake and then you put someone else in that same system, they'd likely make the same mistake. A strong safety culture supports both patients as well as those of us that have dedicated our careers to caring for them. All right. Well done, everybody. You made it through the first domain. Hopefully that was painless. Let's now enter into our first foray of practice questions. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to review these questions. I'm going to give you some time to respond and participate. Then I'm going to walk through the questions and the correct answer. Now, word from the wise here, there may be multiple good answers. This makes it maybe a little bit tricky. There may be multiple good answers, but there always is a best answer. So read the question carefully, eliminate those options that you know are wrong, and then make your best choice. And we'll learn from this together and get plenty of practice. So for the first question, and this is a little awkward because it's going to ask you to refer back to this image. And so if you can look at this image, try to commit as much of it to memory. It's not going to be too focused on the numbers. It's more on the concepts. But look at this image, and then we're going to go to the next slide, which has the actual question. Okay. The graph that I just showed you shows the teamwork climate results, or SAQ, for your organization. What is the appropriate response to this data? A, initiate teamwork development in all the departments below the 50th percentile. B, initiate teamwork development in all the departments below the 25th percentile. C, do nothing more than 75% of the departments scored above the desired threshold of 60%. Or D, consider the other domains of the survey before defining actions. So you should see a poll in front of you now. Take some time to reflect on this question, submit your choice. I'm going to give you typically around 60 seconds, but my goal is to have over 80% of you participate in these questions. So that's my engagement goal for you. We're going to try to hit that 80%. Great work so far. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so, especially as we're getting used to the polling system. We're at 90% participated. I knew this group was great. All right, we're at 96%. What a high bar. Let's go ahead and close the poll and we'll go through the correct answer. All right. So the correct answer, and hopefully you can see the results. The majority of you selected D, consider the other domains of the survey before defining actions. And I am very pleased to report the correct answer was D. So very good start. Yeah, the data that we saw, and I understand those of you that picked A because you're going to kind of focus on those lower developing departments, and A and B, I can see why those might be okay answers. But really, to get the complete picture before we invest in an action, we need to consider the other domains of the survey so that we have a more holistic, comprehensive view. That's what makes D the best answer in this case. All right. Nicely done. Great start, everybody. Let's go on to the next one. A nurse on a medical surgical unit does not comply with barcode medication administration, BCMA, while caring for one of her patients. As her supervisor, how should you address this situation? A, ask staff if there are adequate scanners to meet their needs. B, counsel the nurse on the importance of following policy. C, request that the pharmacy run a report of BCMA compliant rates on the unit. Or D, ask the nurse what was occurring at the time and why she chose to bypass the policy. We'll go ahead and open the poll, and just like last time, I'll wait for you to respond. Lightning fast, right up into the 90s. Well done. I feel comfortable. We can go ahead and close the poll. 90% of you chose the correct answer, and the correct answer was D. Ask the nurse what was occurring at the time and why she chose to bypass the policy. These are all good choices. You can see how you might be able to do some of these things. The idea is, how should you address it first? And before you jump to a cause or running reports, it's important to understand the situational context. So the first thing you're going to do is ask that nurse what was occurring at the time and why she chose to bypass the policy, because there may be a valid reason. And so understanding the context will then determine the next steps, which may include A, B, or C. Right? But D is the correct, and most of you got that right. Well done. We're on a roll. So on to the next question. A focus on collecting, analyzing, and providing feedback on near miss reports is most likely to improve which of the below? A, patient satisfaction. B, culture of accountability. C, the organizational commitment to safety. Or D, core measure compliance. Go ahead and open the poll, and I await your responses. I don't want to. I don't want to jinx us, guys, but this might be the most engaged group I've had in a long time. We jump up to the upper 90s right away, so I really hope we can continue that engagement. All right, Chrissy, I feel comfortable closing the poll here. We're in the 96% engagement. The correct answer was the one that, again, the majority of you chose: the organizational commitment to safety, which was, excuse me, C. C is correct. So a focus on collecting, analyzing, and providing feedback on near miss reports may not do as much for patient satisfaction. It may contribute to core measure compliance, but likely not the best answer. It can contribute to culture of accountability, but and based on what we talked about, that idea of focusing on collecting, analyzing, and providing feedback really directly ties back to one of those principles of organizational commitment to safety, which is why C here is the best answer. Okay, on to the next one as we get some more practice. A patient safety professional has identified executive leadership engagement as a patient safety performance goal. The best intervention to increase leadership engagement is executive A, sponsorship of departments with identified safety opportunities. B, attendance at all patient safety committee meetings. C, sign off on monthly and quarterly patient safety metrics reports. Or D, participation in an annual facility patient safety campaign. We're going to open the poll. Give everybody another 10 seconds or so. We're already at 90+%. All right, excellent. This is a tougher one. Let's go ahead and close the poll, and we'll talk through it. So the correct answer is the one the majority did choose at 52%, and that's A. Although there was a significant number of you that chose B and D. So A is correct. Let's talk through this. So again, this is a good example of the best answer versus some good answers. The reason A is the best answer is it's because it's that active leadership sponsorship. That sponsorship implies that they're supportive, they're actively engaging, they're tied in with those departments that are improving safety. Attendance, yeah, it's good to role model attendance, but it's not necessarily, as B says, it's not active engagement. You can attend a meeting with being on your phone or your computer the whole time. I think not many pick C. And yes, just signing off on something, probably not as engaged. And D, yes, you want participation in annual facility patient safety campaign, but that's just annual. That's once a year. Um, and so we do want a little bit more regular engagement, which is why A is the correct answer here. Okay, next one. In general, everyone doing an excellent job. A known barrier to patient safety is staff not speaking up when they are concerned or if they see safety violations. You would help foster a culture that supports speaking up by A, putting up posters around the organization that reinforce speaking up as a safety strategy, B, using culture of safety data to assist low performing departments with defining strategies for improvement, C, using trends in event reporting to identify staff who don't speak up, or D, re educating management on the use of just culture principles. All right, another 5 seconds or so. Yeah, this is another one that has some good choices. This is a better versus best decision. Right. Why don't we go ahead and close the poll? We've met our goal. And this one definitely was a little trickier. So we had 36% select B, which was the correct answer using culture of safety data. 21% picked A, and 36%, so matching the correct answer in terms of number of responses, was D, which was incorrect. So the correct was B. Let's walk through this one. All some decent choices here. B is correct, and I'll go through the other ones here in a second. But really, what we want here is to foster a culture that supports speaking up by using data to assist people that struggle with this with really targeted strategies. So a lot of active data driven improvement. Posters are not a bad idea. It's a little less active, it's a little more passive. It's a little more passive in terms of an approach. I still like it, but not as good as B. D, yes, you want management to know just culture, but this is an organizational wide need. This needs to be frontline and management. So just because management know doesn't necessarily help everyone speaking up, which again makes B the better answer. And thank you for not many of you picking C, because we don't want to just identify specific people. That's a little bit more blame than we want with a good just culture. Okay. And with that, we did it. You've gone through your first round of practice questions. We will have more practice questions on culture at the end of the day tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed our first module. We are at 1:17 Eastern time. Our break isn't scheduled for another 7 or 8 minutes or so, and so we'll just keep this moving. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Sherry, who's going to go into our second domain, which is performance measurement, analysis, improvement, and monitoring. So take it away, Sherry.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about these topics. This module of the program is quite large, and so you'll notice in the agenda it gets broken into two different sections because it is so long. And so hopefully we have planned enough little activities in there to keep you engaged, and then also I encourage you to keep participating in the chat. That's been great. So let's dig in. All right, so the objectives of this portion of the program are to design, process, outcome, and balance measurements, interpret collected data, and draw conclusions, construct data displays to facilitate decision making, describe specific methods for proactive and reactive risk analysis, identify and understand how to apply various improvement methodologies, compare and contrast change and project management methods, including team facilitation. And the next three slides are basically just highlighting or outlining what the content of the upcoming presentation will be. So the first group of things that I will review with you are measurement methods. And then we'll move on to review and analysis, and we'll review some tools and processes and also barriers to those steps. And then lastly, we'll talk about improvement and sustainability, which are key aspects to measurement analysis, improvement, and monitoring, this whole section of the program. All right, so data. We have tons of data in healthcare. In fact, oftentimes we're overwhelmed with the amount of data that we have available to us, and we're measured on so many things. And so, John referred to earlier kind of that survey fatigue. I think sometimes we have data fatigue, but I think it's a great problem to have when it comes to safety, so that we can actually measure how we're doing. And the data isn't always numbers or from reports and things like that. They can be those family members. The sources of the data can be the family members or neighbors of people who have experienced patient safety events. And I think we're all familiar with Emily Jerry, who's pictured in this slide, and then the Josie King story, and they're devastating stories. Another one is the Vanderbilt case where the patient received Vecuronium instead of Versed. So we've seen those things in the news and are very well highlighted. But there are things that happen every day to people that may not have as big as a consequence like that, where a patient passes away as a result of an event, but they can have significant consequences on humans. So it's just, I think, we need to keep those data sources in mind also. All right, we're going to delve into measurement now. And as pharmacists, John and I love measurement. Not that other professions can't love it too, but I think we're more likely than some to really like measuring. But we'll review now some ways that we can measure things. So process mapping is one way that we can analyze the process. So this can also be referred to as a flow chart, and it helps us understand the process as it currently operates, not necessarily how it would ideally operate. So when we do a process map, we want to make sure it's how it's currently going today, which oftentimes deviates from what the ideal state is or what is on paper. And process mapping helps us visualize the sequence of steps in a process. And so it can help us figure out where we might have variation and help visualize where things might fall apart and where we might want to make improvements. I'll also mention here that process mapping or flowcharting is used in failure modes and effects analysis, and I will be talking about that topic quite a bit more later. So I won't delve into too many details around that now. These are the steps of process mapping. So first, you need to define the process boundaries. Sometimes we can get a little carried away if we don't define the beginning and end point of the process that we're working on. And so I think it really helps a group that's working on a project to stay within those boundaries if we define that up front. And it prevents that scope creep. Then we should identify the process steps. And the way we typically will do that will be, if we're in person, a sticky note exercise where we have participants in the group write on a sticky note the steps in a process that they complete when they are participating in a process. If you're using a digital tool, there's also ways you can do digital sticky notes and work through that if you're more in a virtual setting. And then you work towards sequencing those steps. And you'll note sometimes when you do a process map that some individuals say, well, I don't do it in that order. And so you'll get some variation there. And it's just really important to get things in the order in which people do it. Then you have to incorporate the decision points in the process map, and those are represented by diamond shapes. So you can take your sticky note or whatever and turn it on its angle so it's a diamond. And you want to organize those or write them in a way where the answer is yes or no, so that you can have the process map flow into a branching, so that you can see where if you answer yes, it goes one direction. If it answers no, it goes in another direction. And then the next step you'd like to do is to validate the process steps. And a great way to do that is to actually go out into the workplace where the process is being carried out and make sure that the process map that you've put together actually follows the steps in the order that they're actually happening. And then once you get it all finalized, you want to share it with experts to get their feedback to make sure that they agree that it is an accurate representation of the process as it currently stands. I think I hit it twice. Sorry. All right. Why do we measure? Actually, I think we're really close to our break time. John, you think we should break here? Because I may talk a fair amount on this slide.
I think that's perfect. We're right there, Sherry. So thanks for recognizing it. So
Yep.
everybody, let's take our 10-minute break now and reconvene at 1:35 p.m. Eastern time. Enjoy the break. All right, Sherry. I see it's 1:35 Eastern, so welcome back, everybody. Hopefully, you got a little rest, some recaffeination, and I'm going to turn it back over to Sherry.
Thanks, John. So now we're going to delve into some more reasons why we measure. One reason is to improve care and service to our patients, and so that's our primary goal with everything that we're doing here. And benchmarking and comparing performance with other external entities or even other hospitals or clinics within our health system is a really valuable thing to do that helps us avoid getting into that mindset that good enough mindset where we're thinking, oh, yeah, we're doing fine. I think if we continue to compare ourselves to other organizations, we're able to continue to strive toward improving and doing even better and better. And so that's a really valuable part of measuring. We also want to track progress to improvement. And so much of what we're doing as patient safety professionals is trying to improve our processes and systems. And so as we put actions into place, it's really important to track our progress and make sure we are achieving the goals that we have set out to accomplish. And then we want to spread and sustain improvement. And so this is one of the more challenging things, I think, sometimes, is to make sure we sustain improvements because there are many competing priorities in organizations. And so if we keep tracking our progress and making that visible, it's more likely that we're going to continue to have focus and attention placed on whatever initiative is that we have set as being a priority. And then also, it's important to do pilots oftentimes before you're going to spread a change. And part of doing that pilot is to measure how we're doing. And then that can help justify to other departments or other hospitals in the system why it is that we need to spread whatever work we've piloted. And that will, it helps tell that story. And then we can measure once we've spread it to other departments or other hospitals or clinics in the system and make sure we're sustaining that. Next, monitoring and informing system performance. To do that, we will monitor process measures. Also, we may refer to those as leading measures, and outcome measures, which we refer to as lagging measures sometimes, and then balanced measures or balancing measures. I've heard them called either. And I'm going to delve into more detail of those in subsequent slides, so I'm not going to talk about them a ton here. And then lastly, accountability. We want to identify and track our progress toward those organizational goals that have been set. We also have governance and fiduciary responsibilities. And then we also oftentimes will align goals or measures with financial incentives for leaders and staff in the organization. So there may be a bonus or something like that tied to our performance. And so we will sometimes tie those measures to those goals so that we can attain that level of accountability that we need for some things that are very important. On this slide, what we're going to do is compare quantitative and qualitative data. And quantitative data is typically something that is expressed as a number, so it can be quantified. And those quantified data can be analyzed statistically, and they are associated with a measurement scale. So it could be something like weight or time or height. So listed on this table, we have someone's height measured as 6 feet 7 inches. So that would be a quantitative piece of data. And qualitative data is typically more categorical, and it's not expressed as numbers, but more as a natural language. And it can be categorized in ascending or descending order. And we call those ordinal variables. So example of that, maybe oftentimes on a survey, we'll have respondents specify if they disagree, agree, or have a neutral response. So those are those types of ordinal categorical data. And then an example of that here on the table is very tall. So we might describe someone who's 6'7" as being very tall, but that would be the qualitative description of that piece of data. So this is where I'm going to delve a little more into process and outcome measures, as I alluded to a couple of slides ago. So process measure involves that we confirm that an action has been implemented. So it might be hand washing. It might be providing a certain intervention or treatment to a patient. That would be the process step. And typically, process measures can be observed in real time, and we call those leading indicators. And we believe that those process measures are going to lead to an outcome. And so they're easier to monitor. Oftentimes, when we're doing improvement projects and things like that, it does make sense to monitor process measures because it may take a very long time, or it may be very difficult to obtain the outcome measure data. But ideally, you would have both process and outcome measures. But sometimes you only implement a process measure. So here, some other examples of, well, I mentioned percent of patients receiving an intervention already as an example of a process measure, or hand washing with hand gel. So outcome measures really determine if that action that we think is going to lead to the outcome was actually effective. And these are lagging indicators because they do take time typically for us to see after the process or the action is taken. It may take some time to see that outcome. Examples of this might be a mortality rate. So if a patient did receive an intervention, was mortality rate reduced? And an example for the situation where we're promoting using alcohol-based hand gel, what we would anticipate seeing as an outcome would be a reduction in hospital-acquired infections. Balancing measures. These are changes, or we have to ask, are the changes that we've put into place, are they going to create some unintended or inadvertent change in our system that we really don't necessarily want to see? So really you have to think about what might happen that might be maybe negative, or that we didn't anticipate what might happen. And so you have to think about those consequences to be able to design those balancing measures and be able to measure them. So it could be business goals, customer needs, work and culture, or employee contribution, cascade of accountability, performance data, including feedback. So we may implement a change in process, and one of the implications of that may be that employee satisfaction is reduced due to a change in process, and it would be wise to measure that. Another example would be if we implement a project where we're working on reducing length of stay through various interventions. Are we seeing an increase in hospital readmission rates as a result of the project that we are implementing? I'm going to shift a bit to data collection and analysis. So when we're conducting a project or implementing a change, we want to use just enough data to know whether the changes are leading to improvement. We really don't want to go overboard on collecting data. So it's really important to narrow down and define what it is that we need to measure and how much of it do we need to know if we're seeing an improvement. And it's really a good idea to use existing measures if we already have them. Sometimes we don't have that luxury, and so then we have to develop some other way to get to the data. So that might be developing some kind of data collection form that we would have a person serving in a certain role utilize to capture the data. It might also be that we are obtaining data from our hospital system, so like our EMR or things like that. But we need to be really careful that we don't rely on data if we don't have easy and quick access to it. Sometimes pulling data out of our systems can take a while because we have to get the analytic resources to be able to pull the data and make it available to us. And so sometimes, like for example, for me, I have actually a great in the pharmacy department at Kaiser. I have data analysts that are available to me that typically when I need data on safety concerns, they will prioritize my requests, and I can get it within a week or two typically. And I know that a lot of folks we don't have access to that data to that quickly. And so if that's the case, then it is, really important to try to develop ways to measure how we're doing in other ways that are, just more efficient. And then another thing to consider is if you are using something like a data collection form, you want to check back and make sure it's actually being used. If it's not, we may need to address how we're pulling the data. And I think one way we could do it as an alternative to that would be sampling. That does improve our efficiency. So rather than collect data on every single patient that comes through a unit or through a hospital, if we do sampling, maybe we review charts of patients retrospectively, 10 per month, 20 per month, something like that. We can extrapolate those results to the larger population and be able to make an assessment of how well we're doing. And then lastly, it's really important to graph that collected data over time. This is one of our most valuable tools we have with improvement work is to see our progress over time. And so we'll talk a lot more about that throughout this presentation, but just keep that in mind. Right. Now we're going to shift into talking about data sources that aren't necessarily within our organization and where can we get patient safety information to help us know what to do. We may want to compare our performance to other organizations, and can we get that information through these sources? So on this slide, there's a list, and it's certainly not a comprehensive list. It's just some examples of some data sources for patient safety information in the United States. So AHRQ is one of those organizations where they make available quite a bit of patient safety information, including information on the patient safety indicators such as pressure ulcer rates, hemorrhage, perioperative hemorrhage, post-op hemorrhage, things like that. They also have created patient safety culture surveys, and John talked a fair amount about safety culture surveys previously, but they do have quite a few different versions of patient safety culture surveys, and you can access the results of other organizations for those organizations who have submitted their results to AHRQ. So they're a great source for information. Others I'd like to highlight here, as a pharmacist, I have to talk about the medication-related data sources. And so MedMark's Adverse Drug Events is a great place to get information about adverse drug events that have been reported to that organization. Also, Food and Drug Administration has a lot of information on safety. And, lastly, at the bottom, there are a fair number of consumer-oriented sources of patient safety data that we can tap into also. Then we certainly don't want to just focus our information on data from the United States. We also want to look for sources of information internationally. And the World Health Organization is a great place to get that information. The Uppsala Monitoring Center is a organization in Sweden that tracks pharmacovigilance or focuses on pharmacovigilance across the whole world. So it's internationally focused. And then also listed here on the slide are several international governmental agencies that have a lot of valuable information about patient safety. But again, this list is certainly not all inclusive. It's just some examples of places to get information internationally. Then there's a lot of data sources within our own hospitals or health systems to be able to measure. And so, survey results that we talked about this before, patient safety surveys, employee engagement or satisfaction surveys, reported safety events. Something I do want to mention here is that oftentimes I hear requests about asking me how many errors have we had related to X, Y, or Z, and I always focus on in my response. I can tell you how many errors or events were reported, but that is based on voluntary reporting, and so it's not really a great objective measure. And we don't recommend using voluntary reported data to measure success of any kind of change in process or system or anything like that. So just keep that in mind that the reporting data is really helpful to identify where we have problems and kind of serves as a red flag to tell us, we really need to focus on this. This seems to be a problem here because we're seeing an increase in reports related to X, Y, or Z, but we can't use that necessarily as a measure of effectiveness. Let's see. Yeah, I mentioned pulling data from our EMRs or pulling, getting those data requests. Most of us have access to data analysts in some way or another to be able to pull those data. Sentinel event trends are another great source. Complaints, grievances, and compliments. I've seen errors get reported by patients through those systems, and it was never reported in our event reporting system. And so it is really important to consider those events that get reported through those systems. And then we have claims loss runs, financial losses, dashboards, and scorecards, which I'm going to go into more detail about in a little bit. Safety huddles and walk rounds. It's really important if we're doing those huddles and walk rounds that we collect the information that we hear from our staff and patients, if we're talking with patients also, so that we can track how we're doing with various issues that have been identified through those mechanisms. And then standard operating procedures and safety attitude questionnaires, which are quite similar to those patient safety surveys that are administered to staff that I mentioned earlier. Let's talk a little bit about data validation. There are some questions that we should ask about data management. One question is there an internal data integrity or validation process? So it's always good to confirm accuracy of those data feeds that we may have that supplies the data to our reporting functions that we may have. And I will say that in my organization, I've seen situations where we're tracking a metric related to patient safety, and we see that performance just dropped off, and it doesn't make sense. It's just, or it improved or whatever, but typically the performance dropped off or it stayed the same, and it doesn't make sense. You should see some variation over time. And what we found was that with a system upgrade, that data feed broke. And so we were not getting the new data. So it's just really important to consider that and check on a regular basis that your data feeds are actually working. And then also our data locked after a period of time, and so that you can ensure that, okay, this is accurate data. An example of this is I have access to some systems where I can go in and run drug utilization reports. And the system, if I specify I want to run data for a period of time up until yesterday, the system will not let me include yesterday in my report because the data has not been validated, it has not been finalized. There may be some lag in the data coming in. And so I can feel confident that if I pick a date, let's say in the previous week as my ending point, and it allows me to pull that data for that date, I know that that's basically been closed out. it's locked after that point. And so you want to feel confident that if you pull a report today and then you pull that report in a couple years, you want to feel confident that the data you get from that is going to be the same. And so that's just another thing to consider. And then how to manage qualitative and quantitative information. You should think about this because oftentimes our reporting systems do allow gathering of quantitative and qualitative data. The qualitative data could be in the form of free text or narrative information that's entered by the user. Another example of this might be with safety culture surveys. You have a lot of quantitative information that's collected, but also qualitative. And some of that qualitative data are responses that are indicated on a Likert scale. But then there's also a free text section, often at the end of a survey. And you want to use that information because it's very valuable. So, how are you going to pull all that free text out and use it? So, having a plan for that is really important. Let's transition a little bit into talking about some statistical terms. And so, on this slide, we're going to talk about the difference between mean and median. Mean is an average, also known as an average, and the median. They're both measures of central tendency of a set of numbers. And so they're calculated differently. So an average is calculated by summing all of the numbers and then dividing them by the number of samples or number of numbers in that group. A median is determined by ordering them from in ascending order, so from smallest to largest, and then you identify that middlemost number, and that's what the median would be for that sample. And so a disadvantage of an average is that you can have values that are particularly high or low, so they may be an outlier, and they can influence the calculation of an average and skew the number a fair amount. Whereas if you use a median and you're ordering from lowest to highest value, and the highest value, say, is very large, it will not have that impact, or it won't skew the number, the median, because you're still picking that middlemost number. And on the next slide, we're going to review a table that outlines these differences a little more. So a mean is an arithmetic mean of a set of numbers. So as I mentioned before, you add them up and you divide them by the number of numbers that are in that sample. And you can see on the second from the bottom row of this table in the second column, it gives an example of numbers that you're going to calculate the mean or average from. And you divide that number by the number 7, which is the number of data points you have. And the average comes out to be 6. And then on the last line, you can see there's an example where you have numbers that are very similar to the first data set that we looked at, but there is a number of 130 in there. And if you include that in your sum and then divide it by the number of data points in there, which is 8, the average comes out to be 20. So it's quite a bit higher. And so you can see how that outlier can have a significant impact on mean or average. So in the last column, we'll review median and what it is. So it's a numeric value that separates the higher half from the lower half of a data set. It's used to return that central tendency. And what you do is you list them, as I've mentioned a few times here, from lowest to highest or in ascending order, and then you identify that middlemost number. So for the same example as we looked at for mean, we get the median to be 5 when you pick that centralmost number from that same sample. And then the last box on the bottom shows you that same list of numbers, including that outlier of 130. And if you use median, it comes out to be 4. So quite a bit different than that average of 20. So you can see this, I think this demonstrates how the median is not as affected by those outliers. let's talk about standard deviations a little bit. So this is the diagram on the right is your typical bell-shaped curve, your normal distribution of data, and you usually have to have a pretty large sample to be able to see a normal distribution like this. I'll ask the group which of the lines represents the mean in this diagram. Your choices are A, that middle line, B, or C. You could put it in the chat, that would be helpful. You're right, it's A. So that's the mean, that's the measure of central tendency for this. And so which of these lines represent this first standard deviation? And I'll review what it is. Yeah, you're right, it's B. A standard deviation really tells us how compact our data is. So if our standard deviations are large, then what that means is our data is pretty spread out. If the standard deviations are small, then most of our data is really close to that mean, and so they're more narrow. And another name for standard deviation is sigma. And so you've probably all heard about Six Sigma in your activities at work. And so Six Sigma really is looking for reducing variation out to that sixth standard deviation, or Six Sigma. And so it's got really lofty goals of reducing variation in essentially the entire population. All right, what this slide lays out is how descriptive statistics are typically displayed. So descriptive statistics are more around categorical data, and they are usually displayed in bar graphs or pie charts. So if you see a bar graph or a pie chart in a presentation, a paper, or whatever, that is typically going to be descriptive statistics. So it will be describing characteristics of in this example, of a hospital. And what we're looking at here is the percentage of patients that fall under different age ranges. And so in hospital A, you can see that the patient population is 65 or older. 77.2% of the patients are 65 or older. In hospital B, you can see that the population that's 65 or older is 62.5% of the patients that are in that hospital. And descriptive statistics are very specific to that particular hospital or whatever unit or group of patients that you're talking about, and cannot be applied to another unit or hospital or a group of patients. We're going to talk a little bit about inferential tests, or statistical tests, and this may create some anxiety for some of you. That we're not going to talk a whole lot about it, but I think it's important for you to understand the background behind these tests and how we use them in healthcare, and understand what things like a p-value mean. So what we're talking about are tests of significance, and it's a probability that a relationship exists between two variables or a difference exists between groups. So as I talk through this, let's think about an intervention that we're doing. We have two different groups of patients, and one group received a treatment and the other one did not. And we want to determine, is there a difference between those two groups after they received that treatment? So what is a p-value? It stands for probability. So that kind of helps you think about what this really means. So we're measuring how likely it is that an observed difference between groups, so between our groups that receive the treatment or not, is due to chance. So there's always the possibility that a difference that we're seeing is due to chance alone. It really wasn't due to the treatment. And so that's what we're measuring with a p-value. So a p-value that's close to 0 means there's an observed difference that is not likely due to chance. So as it's smaller, the probability is such that that difference is likely due to the treatment, where we don't think it's due to chance alone. So you probably are familiar with that magical number of a p-value less than or equal to 0.05. That's typically in most studies where we specify that the point where it becomes statistically significant. I don't want to get into this too much, but there is a difference between statistical and clinical significance also. So, a change in blood pressure between treatment groups of 2 millimeters of mercury may not be clinically significant, but in a study that's really big, it may show up as being statistically significant because we feel pretty confident that that difference that we're seeing is due to the treatment and not due to chance alone. Here's a graphical representation of a p-value. So the shaded green area is the probability of an observed or more extreme value or result, assuming that the null hypothesis is true. So the null hypothesis is when we go into doing clinical studies, the null hypothesis is saying that there is no difference. And what we're ultimately trying to do, if we're hopeful that an intervention is making a difference, is we want to disprove the null hypothesis. We don't want it to be true. And so if the value falls into that area, then we feel fairly confident that it is not due to chance and there really was an effect of that intervention. Right, we're moving away from statistics now. Hopefully there might be a sigh of relief from all of you. Now what we're going to talk about is data visualization. How can you display your data so that it is understandable? What's the best way to display it to share your results in a way that is most meaningful? And we will review each of these listed techniques in subsequent slides. First, we'll review histograms. And what histograms are, they're bar charts that are used to display variation in continuous data. And continuous data are things that can be measured on a scale, like we've talked about previously: time, weight, size, or height, or temperature, things like that. And one of the advantages of histograms is that it allows for pattern recognition, so that we may not see this in a graph or a table. If you lay it out in a histogram, you may be able to see patterns. So on the right, we have a graph or a histogram of EKG turnaround time. There are 32 data points in this sample. On the x-axis, we have EKG turnaround time in days. And so each one of those groupings is 2 days. So the first column is 1 to 2 days, and then we have the second one is 3 to 4, 5 to 6 is the next one, and so on. And then frequency is on the y-axis. And, from the data, what I see, the pattern I'm seeing is we have quite a few EKGs that are turned around within 1 to 4 days, which is, well, actually, the biggest group is 1 to 2 days, which is great. We want to see a fast turnaround time with EKGs. But what is potentially concerning is if you look farther to the right in that graph, there's a fair number of EKG turnarounds that take significantly longer. And so that would help us, if we were an improvement team working on trying to improve EKG turnaround time. We want to figure out why. Why are we seeing this big group of EKGs that are taking that long? And it will help us focus our attention. And now we have Pareto charts. We've probably all heard about that 80-20 rule. It's also known as the Pareto principle, that about 80% of the effect comes from 20% of causes. Or another way to put it is 20% of our effort leads to 80% of the outcome or effect. And it's a bar chart that's ordered from largest to smallest contribution. So A good way to understand this better is to look at an example, which we have on the right side of this slide. So a Pareto chart here that we have, it's types of errors discovered during surgical setup. And so along the bottom, along the x-axis, we have the various categories such as wrong supplier, excess count, too few count, and you order it, as I mentioned before, from largest to smallest in this graph, in this bar graph. And on the y-axis, on the left side, you have the frequency of those errors. And then on the right side, on the y-axis, you're measuring the cumulative percentage. And so you order them in that descending order, and then you graph out the red line is showing you that cumulative percentage. And once you get to that 80% level, what you'll notice is right after too few count, there's a dot that's right around 80%. That helps you define those vital few, those 20%. And that's going to help you as an improvement team or as a safety professional identify those vital few things or errors that you really want to focus on. The others are interesting, they're important, they're good to know about, but you probably don't want to focus your energy on those because you're going to have a smaller effect if you focus on them. To get the bigger bang for your buck, you really want to focus on those errors that are that 80%. Now we're going to review some different ways, to graph over time. So those previous ones were more bar graph type displays. Now we're going to look at displaying data over time. This slide is showing you leadership rounding data. And along the x-axis, you can see the time parameters, so Q1 through Q4 of a year. And on the y-axis, you have the counts. And so we have a line graph displaying the total number of issues over time. And to be honest, this graph is pretty boring. It really doesn't tell you a whole lot. We don't know how many units were visited during this leadership rounding. We don't know what departments. In Q2, you can see there's an increase above the other quarters, and one might wonder why. Could it be because leadership rounding happened at more in different more units than in the previous quarters or future quarters? And we really don't know why there was that increase. This slide shows you various categories of issues that were collected, and they're displayed in a bar graph. And you can see in this example, we've collected in our leadership rounding caregiver feedback and patient feedback. And they're displayed in different colors. So caregiver feedback is in blue, and then the patient feedback is in more of a grayish color. And the categories of issues that were identified during rounding are labeled along the x-axis. So the first two, we have communication and we have equipment and supplier. And it doesn't really tell you the time frame. Doesn't tell you anything about the unit that was involved. It's giving you a snapshot of one instance of leadership rounding. Now, if you have not, if this is the first time in your organization you ever did any leadership rounding, or first time on a certain unit or department, this might be a really appropriate way to display the data so that you can see those details for that first time. But ideally, we will display data over time, as I mentioned before. It's a very powerful tool to see how we're doing with our performance, see if there are any changes. Here's a much busier line graph. It is a little harder to really take in or absorb what's being displayed on it. But it's a very valuable graph because it's showing you that performance over time. So along the x-axis, again, we have Q1 through 4. We have 5 different lines on here, all different colors. And a tip here is make sure that all of your lines are very easy to discern color wise. So I see that there are two or three that are a little close and are a little harder to tell the difference between. I might choose a different color for one of these lines just to make it stick out a little more, that, so you don't get confused with that trend line over time. And then along the y axis here, we have that total number of issues that are have been collected over those time frames. So you'll notice, for example, the yellow line, we've seen a drop, and then it seems like there's some random variation after that, but there was a significant drop from quarter one to quarter two, and it's kind of stayed lower. Well, what is that topic? Oh, it's communication. So it's possible that we did some work on that unit or in the whole hospital or health system to improve communication, among team players, or between patients and caregivers. So that might make sense to us. We'd want to explore what, if we didn't, we might want to explore what happened there. Why did we see that drop? So this gives you a lot more information. Right. We're going to do a little informal poll here. I'm going to ask you all to put your response to this question in the chat, if you don't mind. So the question is, which of the following chart types would be best used to demonstrate non-random process variation over time? And if you don't know the answer to this, don't feel bad. We're going to go over this in much more detail following this. Right, I'm seeing a lot of A's and B's. All right. All right. So if you answered A or B, those are both good answers. Both C and D are displays of, they're basically a static display of information. The D is just a picture, it's just in time. There's no display of progress or change over time. So that doesn't give you any information. C, it does show you by month of the year performance on different things, but it's really hard to digest. And there's several, I make up with the different colors, and there's several things being measured at each point in time. And so it makes it quite complicated. A and B are probably the best way to do it, because A is called a control chart and B is a run chart. There is a difference between the two. You'll notice with A, there are horizontal lines above and below the red line. And those are called control limits, control lines. And they help you figure out if there's been any significant change. If the change resulted from an intervention, perhaps, or a change in your environment. And B shows for a specific measure. It shows that same graph and the same variation, but doesn't give you the control limits. So it's harder for you to know if the change was actually from your intervention or your change in environment. Hopefully that helps, and we'll go into this some more. So as I mentioned, those are run and control charts. They help you answer two questions. One, does the process contain non-random patterns or special causes? And special causes would be where we're seeing an effect from an intervention or change environment. And what effect did you plan to have on the process? What effect did your plan have on the process performance? We'll talk about the anatomy of a control chart here in a little more detail. So they're similar to run charts, but they have those control limits that I talked about. So along the x-axis, we have weeks. Along the y-axis, we have percent of patients left without being seen. So what we're looking at in this graph is improving number of patients seen by the ER. So we want patients to be seen. We don't want them to leave before they're able to receive care. So we have the data plotted, percent of patients seen over time. So the blue line is showing you the percentage for each week in this sample. The red dotted line in the middle is the median. so that measure of central tendency, and we expect to see variation over time in all the things that we're measuring. You're not going to see a completely straight line, so we expect to see that. You'll notice there's a little blip around week 11 or 12. That might be interesting to know about why that happened, but it does not go above that upper control limit, and so it's unlikely that and it came back down to that other level that we were seeing before. So it's probably not a result of any intervention or any change in the environment. Here we have it's a graphical display of how we determine what the upper and lower control limits are. And you'll notice that the graph on the right, it looks kind of familiar. It looks like that bell-shaped curve or the normal distribution. It's flipped on its side. And what this displays is that you can see where that median line is, that measure of central, or median or mean line, the measure of central tendency. And the upper and lower control limits are set at 3 standard deviations from the mean. And that encompasses almost 100% of our data typically. So we've got 99.7% of our data will fall in those 3 standard deviations plus and minus from that measure of central tendency. So you don't have to set your upper and lower control limits at the 3 standard deviations, but you can use other numbers that you've observed in your system or in the department, but you can default to using the 3 standard deviations as setting your upper and lower control limits. All right, let's do a polling question. December 2012, Hospital A reports a Clostridioides difficile, and I'm going to say C. diff from now on, infection rate of 8% and begins a series of infection prevention measures to reduce hospital-acquired infections in general, including the use of stronger antibacterial cleaners throughout the hospital and hygiene awareness campaign. In December 2013, so a year later, this hospital reports a C. diff infection rate of 4%, so it reduced from 8 to 4%. What is the best conclusion that can be drawn from these infection rates? A, Hospital A was successful in reducing their C. diff rate in 2013. Hospital A reduced the C. diff infection rate through though one cannot tell which intervention was most effective. Multiple infection prevention efforts are needed to drive down C. diff infection rates, and no conclusion can be drawn. So similar to John, I'm going to hope for 80% response rate here. Okay, I see you close your survey. All right, I think we're at 80%. We can probably close the poll. Okay, so you can see that the majority indicated that answer B, Hospital A reduced their C. diff infection rates, though one cannot tell which intervention was most effective. And I can see why you answered that, because it does seem that they did do that, but we don't know anything about what they did, and we haven't tested different interventions to know. However, the correct answer is actually D. And I will show you in the next slide why that is. Right. I'm just going to go ahead and move on because I think it's much easier to explain with this visual. I'm a big fan of visual displays of data. So here we go. So what was presented to us in that question is basically that top graph, that bar graph that shows that the C. diff infection rate was 8% in December of 2012, and then December 2013, it was down to 4%. But on the bottom, you see two different line graphs, and they're plotted over time. And so let's make up they sampled, there's 4 data points, so it's probably quarter 1 through quarter 4. And they plotted their results of C. diff infection rates over time. You can see on the left hand side, there's some variation, there's some up and down performance. So, well, one would assume that normal variation would look like that. And as you can see, it starts at the 8%, and the last value checked was 4%. But when you're looking at that, you can't really say, because there is so much random variation in the data, you can't really say that their rate was really reduced. However, on the right hand side, in the bottom graph, that line graph, you can see there's a steady decline from 8% down to 4% over those 4 quarters. And so that looks like a trend to me. And I would feel more confident saying that it was due to whatever interventions were employed in that hospital in that year that reduced the C. diff infection rates. So hopefully that helps you realize or understand why we really can't draw conclusions. I see these questions are tough. Yes, yes, it is, but it's helping you think through, these items, and if you identify that there's some topic that's a little more challenging for you, or you're struggling a little bit more with, that's kind of the goal of this program, is to help you identify the areas where you need to review a little more. Hopefully we're going to help you think through these things by covering all the content in the program, and you'll feel a lot more confident about things after we get through all the content, I think. All right, so let's talk a little bit more. Let's see. What would we need to understand the difference without the bar chart? I'm not sure what the question. If we didn't have the bar chart and we had the line chart, is it Casey or Cassie? Do you mind? You can unmute yourself and ask your question if you'd like. John, I'm not sure if you understanding what the question is.
I probably could use a little bit more clarity if.
Okay, sorry, I was able to. It wouldn't let me unmute for a while.
Oh, that's perfect. Yes. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I was just going back to the question, and on the screen, I don't recall seeing the difference in the bar chart, right? You had the long question about the difference. So if you go back to the question. Yeah, so here within the question, it states that they had 8%, and then the next following year, it's the 4%. So from my perspective, I like the display, the difference in the charts over time makes sense. But from just the question, I'm thinking like, oh yeah, the decrease was significantly declined. But you're saying because we don't have a visual to match up with that, the correct answer would be D, because we can't confirm or deny. Is that right?
I mean, kind of, but I think that the point here is that understanding the variation piece. And so without tracking it over time, just taking the two disparate samples, you can't really know what's happening in between those periods of time. And so the line graph on the bottom left kind of shows you that random variation.
And but we didn't have that with the question, right?
Exactly.
So I'm like, within the question, I don't know.
Yeah, but that's why you can't really make a conclusion, because you don't know what happened over time. And so I think that the take-home point of this is really that value of plotting it over time versus two lumps of data.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Does that help? Okay. Glad we could address that. Great. Understanding variation. So here we have, how do we know that a change in performance is an improvement? And so there are two types of variation: common cause and special cause. I alluded to these earlier, but so if you look at the graph to the right, we've got the upper and lower control limits. There's a dotted red line in the middle showing you that measure of central tendency. The red line is showing you what common cause variation is. So that's that random variation in a process that you would see regularly. You're not surprised to see it bouncing up and down a little bit. The blue dotted line or the blue circles show you where the data goes above the upper control limit and it goes down below the lower control limit and it goes up and it goes outside of those ranges. And so those are special causes. So it could be you've implemented a change, there's a change in environment, there's something that is different that has led to that change or that special cause. And here we have an exercise I think will help illustrate this really well. So what I want you all to do is to get a piece of paper and something to write with and write your name 5 times with your dominant hand. And then after you do that, switch to your non-dominant hand and write your name 5 times. Then I'll give you a couple moments to do that, and then we'll talk about common cause and special cause. Okay, so you can see when you write your name with your dominant hand, there are little variations. They're minor. It doesn't look exactly the same unless you use a stamp. And that is that common cause of variation where you see little differences here and there. When you change something, your intervention is to write with your non-dominant hand. You'll see that it's really different. It does not look the same unless you're ambidextrous and you're really good. It's going to look really, really different. And that change or that there's an intervention or a change in your environment that is making the variation be so significant, and that is what is called special cause. I see there's a question in the chat. Is an outlier special cause? Not necessarily. So we're going to get into that, but you would expect to see more than just one data point outside of a control limit. Typically, it's 7 points outside, or a pattern of 7, or a trend of 7 data points. So an outlier isn't necessarily. It needs to be sustained for longer than just a singular or even a couple instances. Right, so this is just a graphical representation again of what common cause variation would look like. So think about this graph here where the red line is going up and down, and those are those little variations that you see in your signature or writing your name with your dominant hand. So this is, I guess I should say, this is a run chart where we have again, data plotted over time, x-axis, and then we have patient satisfaction ratings. So we have the percent of patients who are highly satisfied graphed out here. So there's, just random, normal, common cause variation in these data. Here, this is a demonstration or depiction of what special cause variation looks like. So we have the data plotted over time and the measurement. So let's say this is percent of people highly satisfied. Again, we have some drop and come back up, but then we have 7 data points up here. Now, we don't have upper and lower control limits called out on this graph, but pretend they're there and they're above there. That would make you think, okay, something happened that made that satisfaction go up. And you'd want to know what it is. And if you had implemented some intervention, that might make sense that you would see that. So hopefully that helps with understanding. I'll also mention, so you can have, if you have 7 points that are trending up or trending down, those are called trends. This is called a run. You can also see repeating patterns in your data. And if you see that's called a pattern when you're tracking your data in control charts. Typically, yeah. So does the trend, have to be outside the upper or lower control limit. Now, I think the trend could start before, but ultimately, like if you have a run like that, it would be above it. John, can you comment on that? I know we're about time to wrap, but does a trend have to be all entirely outside of the upper or lower control limit? Do you know?
No, not for this case. It just
Yeah.
the same side of the center line, and 7 points is kind of the golden rule. But I've had, depending on the statistician and organization, 5 points, or so it's not a concrete seven, but by seven on either point of the center line, not necessarily outside the control limits, would consider a trend. And with that, another Sherry, great stopping point for our break. And so we're at 2:35 p.m. Eastern time. Another 10-minute break. We'll see you back here at 2:45 Eastern time.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. We are nearing the end of day one, if you can believe it or not. So I'm going to turn it over to Sherry to wrap us up. Thank you, Sherry.
All right, we're going to dive back in. So we'll talk about the importance of developing credible and understandable reports. So it's really important to have effective visual communication of data so that your audience really understands what you're trying to convey. These are two really good resources for you if you want to delve a lot deeper into creating really good dashboards and visual displays of data. Excuse me. Now, we're not going to go into as much detail as these books would, but they're really good references if you have interest. All right, let's talk about the difference between scorecards and dashboards. Sometimes we refer to them synonymously. We think of them as being the same thing, but they are really a little different. Scorecards are a collection of key performance indicators together with their associated performance targets. So basically, they're a snapshot in time, typically of related key performance indicators. A dashboard, though, is a larger container for different items. So it can contain reports, graphs, could include scorecards in there, and some of the information could be seemingly or relatively unrelated. So there could be financial data, there could also be patient safety related data in there. And so they are a little different. So the dashboard tells more of the story, and scorecards give you information about current performance at that point in time around related measures. Here's an example of a scorecard. In the first column, you see various metrics listed, and then we have the targets for each of those metrics. In the second column, the column shows you the performance on that metric when it was previously measured, and then the second to last column shows you the current performance, what we're looking at right now. And you'll notice the different colors, the stoplight colors of green, yellow, and red, and those help you visualize very quickly how we're doing. Green means that we're doing really well. We have yellow, meaning we're close to our goal, but not quite there. And then red indicates that we're not doing so great, and we have a fair amount of opportunity to improve in those areas. Then the last column shows you the trending. So it may be that compared to the previous measurement, we're doing better. So then you would see an up arrow. Here's an example of a dashboard. So you can see there's a lot of data displayed on this dashboard, and one of these boxes of displays could be a scorecard in there. But as you can see, that the data can be displayed in various methods: bar charts, plotting over time, so line graphs, pie charts, and the measures in here could be various. Dashboards are used commonly to present data to decision makers. These oftentimes are high level leaders who have a lot of information coming at them. And so you really want to make sure that your dashboard and even your scorecards are easy to understand. By design, a dashboard does squeeze a lot of information into a relatively small amount of space. So that you put all those priorities all on one dashboard together. It's really important, because you have so much information on those dashboards, to call out information using summarization and exception. And what that means is you may have a text box showing the summary of how we're doing. So we're performing really well in these different measures or areas of the organization, and then call out exceptions where we might have really, really exceptional performance in, for example, our infection rates compared to our hospitals or health systems outside of our own. You'd want to call that out. Or if we have a particular metric where we're not performing very well, and it might be like our lowest performing metric, you could call out that exception in some way. And another advice here is to keep media displays simple. And so those two books that I referenced earlier, Tuft and Few, they do recommend keeping the displays simple so that you don't create distractions. So you don't need to have color degradations. You don't need to have 3D displays on your graphs and things like that. Just keeping it as simple as possible is really, really helpful. What makes a good dashboard? So as I mentioned already, keeping it simple, calling out your metrics very clearly. You have your targets that are very visible. So in this dashboard, we have the metrics listed here: revenue, profit, average order size, on-time delivery, new customers, customer satisfaction, and market share. And the horizontal lines represent our current performance, the dark black lines. And then where those are displayed, you can see where the different colors or shades, I should say, of gray call out where we're performing poorly, satisfactory, and good. The different levels of performance are displayed that way. The actual target is labeled with a vertical line there. So you can see with revenue, we're performing very well. The performance is good. Now look at profit, the next line down. The black line falls in that poor category. And so you can see where an exception is called out here with that red dot highlighting that for profit, we are actually in that poor realm. And we would really like to focus on that moving forward. The actual performance numbers are also displayed here. And you'll notice that there's a trend line that shows our performance over the past 12 months, and that kind of helps visualize: has there been some change, or has our performance been fairly steady? Are we uptrending or downtrending? I will highlight on this graph, I do have one criticism of it. I don't love the fact that it's shades of gray highlighting the different levels of performance, and so it might be a little better to have different colors for the various levels of performance, just so it's easier to quickly identify what level of performance that line is actually in. All right, some other ways to present written results to decision makers. We're all very familiar with PowerPoint, so we're using it today. One great advantage of using PowerPoint is that you can very easily display graphics and to display your data in an easily digestible form. And in PowerPoint, you can also call out those takeaway messages in a text box on the slide. And it's important to use those text boxes to call out the summarization and the exceptions, similar to what we did on the dashboards. And then SBAR, John briefly talked about SBAR a little bit in his section of the program, but I think we're all pretty familiar with SBAR, where you would use it for communication about patient status. So you can use the same format or structure to build your communications about patient safety issues. So a situation might be where we've seen an increase in reported errors related to IV pumps, and we recently started using a new pump across the program or across the whole organization. And so that would be part of your background. You would identify that we changed recently, give some background about why, and then the assessment section you would share the trend in reporting and some more information if you have any additional data about the types of errors that are happening. And then your recommendation should include very specific actions rather than very general recommendations that we should work on this. You really want to call out specifically what actions you recommend and present a couple of options so that the decision makers can make a decision about which option might be best for their team. All right, we have another assessment question here. Board of Hospital A wants to know how Hospital A's safety performance in central line associated bloodstream infections or or CLABSI compares to that of other hospitals in their region. Which data display would best inform them for that decision? A, control charts of overall infection rates by quarter for the past 2 years for each hospital in the region. Or B, a table indicating the CLABSI infection rates of all hospitals in the region relative to the National Healthcare Safety Network benchmark for the past 2 years. C, a written report summarizing the current CLABSI prevention protocols for each hospital in the region. Or D, a table showing the number of CLABSI infections in each hospital in the region by quarter for the past 2 years. Getting later in the day, I think our participation is falling off a little bit. Getting close, we've got 62%. Just a few more people. All right, we're at 79%. That's pretty darn close. Oh, we're above 80% now. Thank you. So, Tracy, can you close the poll? And then we'll see that the majority of respondents indicated B, which is the correct answer. See to the next slide here. So A is not right. You have to pay really close attention to the question and the answer. So overall infection rate is not going to translate necessarily to CLABSI. So that's why that one isn't correct. C isn't correct because presenting the information about protocols in a report is just not going to be the best way to share information with leaders to make a decision, because it's too much to digest. And then lastly, a table showing the number of CLABSI infections in each hospital by region, by quarter. Yeah, it's just the table format. So we really like the table indicating infection rates for all hospitals in the region. We're going to transition to review and analysis. So these are the tools that we're going to review in this next section. So RCA and CCA, which are reactive approaches, cause mapping, cause and effect diagrams, and 5 whys are tools that are used typically when we're doing those retrospective or reactive event analyses. And then we're going to talk a little bit about FMEA, which is a proactive approach to improving safety. So root cause analysis, I'm sure all of you are familiar with a root cause analysis, typically triggered by serious patient safety events, or it could also be trends that we've seen with related to different risks or hazards that could potentially cause harm. And so they may not be a serious event that caused harm, but they would have the capacity to potentially. And so the process helps us identify causal factors that are creating that risk and allows us to, deploy actions to eliminate or reduce risk factors. And as I mentioned before, RCA is retrospective, it's reactive, and it's typically in response to an adverse event or condition or trends that we're seeing. This slide outlines the phases of an RCA. So we have to initiate the process, we need to identify that an event has happened. You want to confirm that the event or the trend meets criteria for your organization to actually conduct an RCA. And then you review the event for accuracy and severity, make sure that we have all the information correct from the report. And we will interview people that were close to the event, involved in the event. we move to the analytic phase where we schedule an RCA meeting. And in that meeting, we will focus on action planning for each risk that has been identified or each causal factor. And then we move to the monitoring phase where we check on, well, and what has to happen is changes need to implement. So that's really not called out on this, but that the changes have to happen for us to be able to monitor our compliance with those activities. And then sometimes we need to revisit the plans that we put into place because they are not working in the way or as effectively as we hoped they would. And sometimes, just speed up the process is also helpful after we've implemented a change. So there's different methodologies to use for RCA. There's the traditional form of RCA that many of us have participated in. There's also something called common cause analysis, which has similarities to an RCA, but an RCA is typically focused on one event, whereas a common cause analysis involves analyzing related events. So, for example, you may have noted that there have been quite a few anticoagulation related significant harm events, and you may want to analyze all of those events together to figure out those common causes. So in your analysis, you identify the causal factors, and then you have to basically categorize them all together. And then once you identify those most common causes or causal factors, then you would outline some risk reduction strategies or actions to take for each of those. And it's very unlikely that you would be able to identify all of those causal factors. Rather, you would focus on the most common or most significant. Then we have fishbone diagramming, which we'll go over a fair amount here in a bit. Cause and effect trees. And then RCA squared isn't necessarily a different methodology for RCA, but it is a great resource for all of you if you're not familiar with it. It was a publication by National Patient Safety Foundation, who's come under the umbrella of IHI since the publication happened. And the aim of this publication is to prevent future harm and gives guidance on conducting very effective RCAs. So a little more on RCA2, that publication. The goal is to improve the effectiveness of RCAs, outlining methodologies to lead to more effective RCAs, identify significant flaws to be remediated, to actually see improvements in patient safety, and prevent future harm through taking action. So it is very focused on the action portion of RCA because it does seem to be the most challenging aspect of conducting RCAs. Typically, analyzing the event, what happened, identifying the causal factors, those are typically easier to do than actually implementing the changes and then ensuring that those changes continue and they sustain over time. So emphasis is really around implementing strong actions for each of the causes. And it supports risk-based prioritization of qualifying events. Most of you are probably familiar with something like this. This is the hierarchy of effectiveness that is published in RCA squared, and it helps you define or determine for each of your causal factors what the level of effectiveness of your actions are. And what you're striving to do, as mentioned before, is go for those stronger actions. We really don't want to rely on weaker actions alone for our action planning for RCAs. It's totally appropriate to have a weaker action layered with an intermediate or strong action. And so it's just important to keep those things in mind. So on the right, you can see there's a graphical display of various levels of action. So the examples of weaker actions are warnings and labels, rules, protocols, policies, education, and training. And I do think there is a fair amount of tendency in organizations to focus on reminding staff about policies, or maybe revising a policy in some way, or educating or re educating staff on a process or a system. But those are not very strong actions. And so we don't want to rely on those if there's anything else we can do that might be higher leverage. And so warning labels also fall in that weaker category. More toward the middle and that intermediate level are checklists and cognitive aids. And John talked about checklists in the past or in our earlier in the presentation. Also simplification and standardization, which he also talked about. It's very wise to have standardization across a department, across the whole organization. So if you have any float pool that's moving between units or departments, it's really helpful to have standardization and to simplify things as much as possible. And then automation and computerization, so things like alerts and reminders, or override an alert that requires an override by a provider, or standardized order sets within your EMR to help standardize things. Those are some examples that fall under there. And then stronger actions are culture change. And as we all know, and based on what John shared earlier, culture change takes a long time. And so and it can be very hard. So that's something certainly to strive for. And if we can accomplish that quickly, that's great. But it may take quite a while to do that. Forcing functions and constraints are other things, and then equipment and environmental redesign can also help with reducing harm and are very strong actions to take. So an example under here might be where you change the enteral syringes that you're using so that they don't match up with the IV tubing when you are, so you don't accidentally administer enteral feedings into an IV tube. That would be a forcing function because you cannot connect them together. What determines a thorough and credible root cause analysis? These are defined by the Joint Commission. We want our RCAs to be thorough, so to focus not just on human factors, but also underlying systems and processes. So it should be very comprehensive in that way. It should address all areas identified in the RCA matrix and identify all risk points. And there should be improvements outlined for all of those risk points, or changes in process or systems or actions that we would take to address all of those risks. And then it should also be credible, which that would be described by having participants involved that have varying backgrounds. You certainly want people who are involved in the work regularly and know the processes and systems in that area, but it's also a good idea to have people who have a little different perspective and sometimes may think a little differently about something than the people who do the work every day. And you really want to have leaders and people involved who are able to have the authority and the ability and the resources to ensure that changes will happen involved. You also want your RCAs to be internally consistent. And what that means is that you have a template or a format that you use on a regular basis, and that's used for all RCAs. So people know what to expect, and we do things the same way from RCA to RCA. And then another thing that's important to do is if there is a risk that's identified and there really is no ability to implement a change that will impact it, or it's really not a problem, it needs to be explained more. Yeah, the RCA matrix, sorry, I see the question there. Where do we find the RCA matrix? I believe that is in the RCA squared document. We can double check that. So anyway, explaining those things that we say are not applicable or are not a problem, explaining why that is. Now we're gonna, I moved a couple slides. Now we're gonna talk a little bit about drilling beneath the surface. Let's get to the root of the problem. And the tools that we would use for that in an RCA would be the 5 Whys, flowcharts, and Ishikawa diagrams, which are also known as fishbone. And then we'll talk about sharing of lessons learned, how to disseminate that information from the RCAs throughout the organization. Here's a picture of a fishbone diagram. Got the problem on the right, and that's the effect, the outcome. And you work backward and fill out the fishbone diagram with the causes that have been identified. The steps are to define the issue, construct that skeleton. You can label the lines coming out of the spine. Some suggestions here are measurement, materials, personnel, environment, methods, and machines. Sometimes those labels don't apply to your work setting that you're where the event occurred, and so you can label them with different categories if needed, whatever fits the setting that you're working within. Then conduct a 5-minute brainstorm for each of those categories that you have defined and labeled, and ask how could that have caused the issue to occur, and then add the responses to the diagram. If in a group, discuss the potential root causes and share relevant information, and determine a root cause or a few leading contenders to further investigate. We'll have an example here. This example is a coffee shop that has bad coffee, and they're wondering why customers were complaining about the coffee. And the print is really small here, and I need some updated prescription lenses. Under procedures, we have too much coffee as a potential cause that was listed. Too many grounds, too much water, so maybe the coffee is weak. Under equipment, brew time too long, dirty baskets, dirty cups, coffee not hot enough. So you probably get the picture of how you use this. But then after you fill this out, you decide as a group which of the areas to focus on. We also have cause and effect trees, and again, this one is really small, but basically that just works through the factors or the aspects that occurred in the event that contributed to the effect, which is described at the very top here. So action planning expectations. For each of the findings identified in the analysis as needing an action, make sure you indicate the planned action expected, the implementation date, and the associated measures of effectiveness. So, as I mentioned before, for each of the findings, we should have an action or more than one action. And it's really important, it doesn't call this out here, but you also want to identify the accountable person who will carry out the action. And it's really important to have that implementation date and those measures of effectiveness. And if, after consideration of a finding, the decision is made to not implement something, an error reduction strategy, it's important, as mentioned previously, to indicate the rationale for not taking an action at this time. It may be that this time it's not the right time, but a year down the road you may pursue it, but explaining that and the reasons why would be very important. Pitfalls of RCAs. Lack of leadership support. It's really important for your leadership to understand RCAs, the process, what the outcomes should be, and have their support to help break down barriers if you were to encounter any barriers when trying to implement your actions. Skipping the chronology, consideration of system contributors not broad enough, so you really focus more on the human actions and not so much on the systems or processes that contributed to an outcome. Consideration of at-risk behavior is insufficient. So this is something important to address. So there may be, John talked about at-risk behaviors in his section of the program, and there may be some drift from processes or from a policy or procedure for various reasons, and those may be at-risk behaviors. And so it's important for management to stay on top of whether or not at-risk behaviors are happening. And so there may be a management aspect even to the development and persisting of those behaviors on a particular department or in an organization. So those can be challenging conversations to have and a little difficult at times, but they should be conversations that are had so that you can address that drift or whatever the at-risk behavior may be that has somehow become normalized over time. Uh, Considering external sources of knowledge, so learning from other organizations what they've done to reduce risk related to whatever the event was. Not linking causation to the actions, weak actions. We talked a fair amount about the hierarchy of effectiveness for actions. So really try not to have just a weak action for a causal factor. Try to layer it with something that's a little higher in effectiveness as in addition to that. Failure to carry out action plans and measure success, focus too narrow or too broad, and then unjust punitive actions. We certainly don't want that to be the result of an RCA. So we're going to talk a little bit about communication in healthcare. This is a common theme that we see in reported events. And in fact, there's a fair amount of external information out there that's been published around the contribution of communication to patient safety events. The Joint Commission has cited communication failure as the number one contributing factor in reported Sentinel events. And you're probably not surprised to see that because I'm imagining almost every Sentinel event that you have in your organization, communication failure is one of the contributing factors. The VA National Center for Patient Safety has identified communication failures in approximately 75% of more than 7,000 RCAs of adverse events and close calls. So that's a big number. Closed malpractice claims from various clinical settings showed that ineffective communication and teamwork contributed to medical errors and patient harm in 43% and 70% of cases. More stats here. You can use this information if you really want to help justify in your organization doing some work around improving communication in your healthcare teams. These studies are really good to refer to help justify that. And then also looking at your reporting data and the events that you've had in your own organization, calling out how many of them had communication failures as a contributing factor would be helpful. Anyway, so resident physicians from surgery, internal medicine, and OBGYN training programs of a university teaching hospital perceived communication failures as a factor in 91% of adverse events and near misses. And observations of surgical teams in the OR revealed 30% communication failure rate, with 36% of those failures leading to visible negative effects, including procedural error, team inefficiency, tension, resource waste, and workarounds, patient inconvenience, and delay. We're going to shift a little bit. We're going to talk about the proactive risk assessment tool that I referred to earlier, failure modes and effects analysis. I may refer to it as FMEA moving forward. So it's a proactive analysis technique that's used to prevent problems before they occur. So if you have a new unit opening in your hospital, or you have a new system that's getting rolled out, new IV pumps that we talked about before, it would be really wise to perform an FMEA on that and identify the risk points before you actually implement a change. So we really want to focus on what could go wrong instead of what did go wrong. So that's how it differs significantly from an RCA. Now, components include identifying a high-risk process, assembling a team, to help with the flow chart or process map, and brainstorm potential failures. When you're visualizing that flow chart or the process map, it's easier to visualize where the failures may happen, And then you will list those failures in, typically it's a spreadsheet or some kind of tool, and you will then prioritize those failures in terms of criticality. So how bad is that negative outcome that may result from that failure? Identify root causes of those failures, and then from that information, you prioritize those those failures, and then you redesign the process or the system to effectively mitigate those risks. And then you would analyze and test the new process and implement and monitor the redesign process. You could use an FMEA also if you're changing a process that already exists. You could implement or utilize that tool for that. This slide, we just want to call out flowchart and its bones. We haven't done that yet in this presentation, so it doesn't necessarily apply to an FMEA here, but the key points with the flowchart are you have a starting and stopping point. So those are the ovals. It starts here, it ends here. So we've defined our boundaries of the process that we're going to map out. These are those diamond shapes that I referred to earlier where the decision points are. And you word those as yes, no questions. And you use arrows to highlight the flow as the workflow would go. And so if you have a yes, no question, yes, the answer yes, you proceed one way on the workflow. If you say no, you proceed the other way. The rectangles are steps in the process that are outlined. And I think that's everything. So just keep those key points in mind when you are building out flowcharts and process maps. Back to an FMEA matrix. So this is just an example calling out one of those failure modes. So, which is, in other words, what could go wrong. So on the second line, well, I guess it's the third line, a decision needs to be made related to where a patient will be screened and will all patients be screened. The next column highlights the effects of that failure. So in this case, the patient may come to a suite and not be MRI eligible. Another outcome could be, patient dies. So that would be, something to call out. Like if the potential risk is that you would have significant patient harm, you could call that out in here. Potential causes of the failure are listed here. We have 2 causes listed. And then current controls. So this would be, what do you have in place that could prevent the failure mode from happening? What kind of mitigation strategies are already in place in your system? And so you score each one of these. And I'm going to, on the next slide, we'll give an example of the scoring technique that you would use to categorize and score each one of these aspects. Actually, the last column here is the RPN, which is the risk priority number. And that's what the purpose of the scoring is, to calculate that risk priority number, which then helps you decide which things to prioritize in your FMEA. So this is just an example of rating scales for risk priority numbers. So in this case, we have severity. What would be the worst possible outcome? And you would rate it from 1 to 5. So in the case where I suggested, death might be the outcome, you would rate that 5, very dangerous. What was in that table, I believe it was the patient may show up without having an MRI or not being MRI eligible. What effect would that have on the patient? That would probably be less impactful, so you would score that lower. Frequency, how often might it occur? So again, this involves a fair amount of speculation, but you could probably estimate how often a failure might happen. Detectability is, how likely can we discover this failure mode before it actually reaches the patient? And so if we have the ability to detect it, then the consequence or implications of that are lower. And then controls. Are there preventive controls in place, and do they work? So do we have a way to catch it before it actually reaches the patient? And you score that appropriately. But keep in mind that the risk priority The lower it is for a failure mode, the lower risk it is. A higher RPN means it's riskier. Keep that in mind when we're thinking about these scores. All right. Now we're going to shift a little bit to measuring effectiveness of actions. We want to make sure that the measures that we have provide data that really truly assesses the effectiveness of the action. So sometimes we are measuring something that really doesn't, the data we're using doesn't really tell us about the effectiveness of our action. Consider whether pilot testing of a plan improvement should be conducted. I highly recommend conducting pilots whenever possible, unless a change is really not that big of a change, because we're not sure oftentimes, unless we pilot, what the potential implications may be, what unintended consequences might we have, or how could we tweak the change in some way to make it better before we expand it. It's much easier to change things in a pilot than it is after you've rolled it out to a whole organization and then you have to change something. So really iron out the kinks in a pilot if you can, if you need to, before you spread it. And improvements to reduce risk should be implemented in all areas where applicable. So, as I was saying, spreading to other parts of the organization is really important, especially, event may have happened in one department, but every department in the entire organization uses that process or system. You would want to make sure that you roll out that change broadly. Necessary follow-up, recognize employees' efforts and contributions. So it takes a lot of time and thought and effort for individuals to be part of the process, the action planning process, and help design those changes. So it's really important to recognize those employees for their contributions. Also, listen to employees when they share their impact. Everybody's voice is important, and that's going to help with your culture and your organization if you listen to the people who are doing the work. Share the data that show impact broadly with leadership, with frontline, especially if you're rolling out a change across the whole organization. You really want to share that data broadly. Adapt plan if it's not having intended effect. So that again is really valuable aspect of doing a pilot. You can measure, is it having the intended effect or not? And you may pilot it, and then once you expand it to the rest of the organization, you may discover that the entire organization you're not seeing that effect there, even though you did in your pilot site. So you may have to tweak your approach a little bit. Ensure accountability and follow through of action plan items. So as we talked about earlier, naming people who are accountable, people who have that decision making and resources to be able to make sure that the actions are completed, and defining the timelines and defining how we're going to measure that success. And then you, as the patient safety professional, marking your calendar for 3 and 6 months follow-up, or even more, depending on how long you think follow-up needs to happen to ensure that the changes have been sustainable. Taking that accountability on yourself to check on things is really, really valuable. Keep leadership informed of progress and barriers, because they are your advocates to help break down barriers when you're encountering them. And then share lessons learned so that we can learn from those for future implementations. Simulation is a tool we can use to help spread or implement changes, get everybody on board, get them trained. So high fidelity simulation is helpful for training and resuscitation. So we're using a lot of technology and high fidelity simulation, but low fidelity simulation can be super valuable in a lot of our care settings. And that is really role playing typically, and we can work through processes, ensure people know what they're doing and how to do it if we're using that low fidelity simulation. It can also be called a tracer, where we have a person or an item or digital information that can be followed through a simulated process. So we could do this prior to implementing new equipment. So like if we were rolling out new infusion pumps, or a new process or procedure. Also, a tracer can be very helpful for FMEAs to determine if the changes you think you need to make to that system or process um, are actually effective and leading to that desired outcome that you're seeking. And another thing that the low fidelity simulation or role playing is valuable for is for practicing critical conversations with staff, patients, or families. So if you have a disclosure discussion that needs to happen, or you need to talk to staff about they're not adhering to a procedure, or they're taking part in at risk behaviors, role playing that conversation can be a very valuable exercise. Lessons learned from risk identification and analysis. So, methods that we can use to help spread those changes is storytelling, patient and or family presentations. That is really helps people buy into changes. If you can have patients or family members involved in that storytelling, if you can't, then making sure you tell that story as a representative of them is really important. Also, letters from the board or CEO, emailed safety alerts, video clips can also be valuable. I will say, tapping into existing communication methods that are in the organization already to share information, it can be helpful because they're a way that people are used to receiving communication, and they're reliable, and if there's it's something that is routinely read by an audience, then it's really helpful to tap into that existing communication rather than create your own. Forum ideas. So this would be live sharing of your lessons learned from your RCAs and action plans. Our town hall meetings, frontline staff. It gets that information to them in a very direct way. Various committees, unit-based practice councils, physician and resident forums, and then in person with subject matter experts. I will say that these live venues are seeming to be more and more rare these days, but if you can tap into those resources to share your lessons learned, and changes in process and systems, that's very helpful. All right. I think this is the last section before we get to some assessment questions. We're going to review here improvement methods and models. So, what problem are you trying to solve? You should define that up front. What changes will you make? You determine that once you dig in and investigate the problem some more. How will you know the changes will result in improvement? You have to measure how you're doing to be able to know if you're going to see a change. And then have you thought about unintended consequences or potential failures of the changes? So using FMEA can be helpful with improvement methods and models. You're probably all familiar with the various continuous improvement models, but Six Sigma, which I've mentioned before, a model where the focus is reducing variation, even at those extremes of your data. Lean is more about eliminating waste. Oftentimes, we're picking and choosing tools and methods from multiple improvement models to employ, and you don't have to implement or use all of the tools. You just pick the ones that are going to be most helpful for your problem at hand. So, key components of process improvement: establish your team, articulate your goals, perform a gap analysis between what your current state is and what you're trying to achieve in your ideal state. Perform small tests of change. So this is using the PDSA, Plan, Do, Study, Act, or PDCA, some people refer to it as Plan, Do, Control, Act. And then spread those changes. After you've worked out the kinks in your smaller pilot, then you spread that change. I mentioned PDSA already. So you make small scale, testable changes quickly. That's a key. You make a quick change, you measure it, decide really quickly did that work or not. If it didn't work, you shift gears. If it did work, but it didn't work quite as well as you wanted, you may keep part of that and then you add something new to it. This just displays the importance of measuring that improvement using data of some sort, a reasonable piece of data that you can collect easily. It doesn't rely on some big data request. Typically, with the PDSA cycles, you want to have something that's right there, readily available, and you use that data to adjust your plan. I already mentioned, I talked a little bit about Lean and Six Sigma already, but Lean activities are categorized as value based and non value based. And the focus is to eliminate waste in your process. The goal is to streamline operations and gain customer loyalty by eliminating waste. So this was really in a manufacturing environment where it was developed, but a lot of people really have bought into the idea that lean can be applied very well to the healthcare setting. Six Sigma, as I mentioned before, it's very data driven and trying to reduce variation down to that sixth standard deviation. The goal is to fine tune processes to be extremely precise. Very, very few companies will achieve the level of Six Sigma. And really, in healthcare, with such a human driven environment, it's really hard. It would be really hard to achieve that level of performance at Six Sigma. So, really, it's around using the methodologies and the tools to apply to the healthcare setting, not necessarily with the goal to achieve that level of performance. But Lean and Six Sigma, they do complement each other, and so you can use tools and methods from both in your projects. The point here is pick a method. Oftentimes, your organization has a preferred method or tools that are already existing that you can grab and use in your environment. And so just use the tools that you have available to you, the resources, and if you have a performance or process improvement team that you can tap into, make sure you utilize their skills when you're working on projects. Communication topic keeps coming up over and over again. So it's important to establish a systematic approach to communication, providing frequent and transparent updates to the team that's involved in the improvement project, but also to the stakeholders and sponsors of the work. Using storytelling, again, is really important to help get buy-in from the people who are participating in the project specifically, but then also the people who are sponsoring the work. They need to understand the implications that whatever problem you're working on have on patients. Use SBAR, which we reviewed before, for succinct messaging. It really helps to structure your communications in that way to make sure it's succinct and you get to your point. Talk a little bit about education. So, education is, as we talked about before, a low leverage risk reduction strategy when we looked at that hierarchy, but it's often necessary to set the foundation or the expectations when we're implementing change. We need to educate for people to be able to make a change, they need to know about it. So, we have to use education. So, it is one of those things that we do that we often layer with other risk reduction strategies or to help support change management in this instance. You need to consider various learning styles. So, if you can create some education or training that meets the needs of people who are more auditory and more visual at the same time or tactile, that is the most ideal situation. Examine the type of change to determine the best educational technique. So, if it's something that requires a lot of hands on work, then something tactile, education where people are actually performing that task would be most helpful. we had a significant system change in our organization, and we were able to set up the test environment for our prescribers to be able to go in there and practice. And we asked them to practice on 2 test patients before we turned on, so each provider, before we turned on the functionality in production. So that was really helpful for the providers to be able to practice. And because it was pretty complicated, it wasn't a simple change. And so we wanted to make sure they understood how to do it. And so that type of education was helpful. Explain the why behind the change. So back to that storytelling, we really need to make sure that we touch the hearts of people. This is why it's really important. Value of storytelling in education and training, as I just mentioned, that's you can align typically the why with that storytelling. And then simulation is also very valuable, and we spent a lot of time talking about that previously. Project management tools that you should be using in your regular work. So if you are carrying out a performance or process improvement project, you want to have a charter. I would say this is a very, very important thing that we have to make sure that we have everybody aligned on what the scope is, define who our stakeholders are and our sponsors so we know how to escalate. You formulate or form your project team. You want to have Gantt or PERT charts that help you with time and resource management. It's a visual display of the timelines and the actions that the group will complete by the timeline that has been specified. It helps keep everybody on the same page about those things. Schedule meetings, create those minutes, produce reports, share them. Define your authority structure. If you're running into barriers, know who you need to go to overcome those barriers. Have those measurements and reports, and have post-implementation tracking. As I talked about before, sustaining change can be challenging, so we need to continue to track those things. All right, evaluation of event and process response. Assign individuals rather than committees to complete actions. So I think that we talked about this a bit before, but we really want somebody in a role who's accountable and has authority to be able to influence change where we need to see that change happen. Set completion dates, we talked about that, and then each action requires at least one measure, either a process or an outcome measure. So sure that we have those things outlined for each action that we've defined. Change can be very challenging for many of us. I like to think of myself as somebody who's pretty open to change, but I know that I feel a little uncomfortable sometimes when change is coming, even though I am a person who is fairly comfortable with it. And I think when you're in more of an improvement role, patient safety role, you want to see change happen. So this model here, the 8 steps of change, was described by John Cotter in his book, Our Iceberg is Melting. And it's a story, or it's based around a story where an iceberg is melting and there's a colony of penguins living on it. And so it helps describe the different steps of change that need to happen in order to bring a group of people along to buy into that change. So you can see the steps listed here. Create a sense of urgency. I think that with patient safety, oftentimes we do have the content or the information that should create a sense of urgency to make change, and telling that story can help get that buy-in. And sometimes that can be the most challenging step. Build a team, you develop change and a change vision and strategy. Understanding and buy-in needs to happen. Empower others. Have short-term wins. Celebrate those when we do have those wins. Don't let up. Be relentless. And then you end up creating that new culture. Anyway, that book is a great book. If you would like to read it, or we can put that reference in the chat. Facilitation needs. We need to consider this when we are, implementing change in our organizations. How do you support team leaders as a patient safety professional? Does the organization provide support for managers and leaders in the organization to make those changes? Something to consider. How do you build collaboration and coordination and effective communication on a team? And then as the team itself that's working on the improvement, you need to do that, but then also expand that to the target audience, to those who need to implement or accept that change. So facilitation is going to be a big responsibility, or is already a big responsibility of yours in your role. So facilitation is a process used to add content, process, and structure to meet the needs of an individual, group, or team. A facilitator leads groups to obtain knowledge and information, work collaboratively, and accomplish their objectives. So, as a facilitator, you need to be skilled in presenting content and information, designing and formulating processes that help achieve the objectives, provide structure to meetings, training, make sure the mission of the group is accomplished through those actions, promote shared responsibility for an outcome, and draw forth from participants answers to questions, get their input on decisions, solutions for problems. Sometimes there are louder voices in a room, and it's really important to draw out feedback and input from people who may not be the most vocal, because sometimes they may just defer to the more vocal folks, but we need to get input from everybody. And as a facilitator, that is one of your responsibilities. All right. I think we're at the assessment questions. Seems like fairly good timing. Sorry if I rushed through some of those. I really wanted to make sure we got to these questions before we wrapped up for the day. So the first question, I think we have 4 of them. Your organization is preparing to change to a new electronic health record. Many departments have been involved with the planning of the huge effort. What would you suggest as part of the preparation strategy? Conduct a root cause analysis, conduct an FMEA, offer a plan, do, study, act session, or offer to do a claims analysis for any related errors. Right, almost everybody has responded. In that poll, the majority of you indicated conduct an FMEA. And that is the correct answer. So root cause analysis would be done for an error or an event that had happened, or a concerning trend. This is a new system we're going to be rolling out. So root cause analysis, we would have no information to analyze. Plan, do, study, act. Again, that's more for a process improvement type situation. Offer to do a claims analysis for related errors. That also really isn't applicable. I don't think anybody answered that one anyway. So conducting the failure modes and effects analysis, forgot to advance the slide, is the correct answer. That proactive approach, figuring out what could go wrong. Right. A new cath lab is under construction in your hospital, and the medical director contacts you to express concerns related to the transport of patients from the cath lab to the ICU. You agree to assist in the design of the FMEA. Components of the FMEA will include assembling a multidisciplinary team whose members will brainstorm potential failures, conducting the 5 whys to figure out what could go wrong, listing potential root causes of adverse events in the current cath lab, and asking the medical director to participate in leadership rounds in the current cath lab to identify potential safety risks. like, oh no, we don't have, we had answers already, like 80%, but not quite. I'll be patient. All right, we're above 80%. The majority of you indicated A was the correct answer, and some of you indicated B. So let's talk through that. The next slide. The answer highlighted. Okay. So A was the correct answer. B, I could see where you would say that. The 5 whys could be helpful after you've assembled a team and after you've highlighted the failure modes and delve deeper into the process. So the 5 whys could be right. It's just not the best answer because you need the team to form before you would, and the 5 whys would be happening much farther down the road. C is not, well, C and D both are incorrect because the assessments are related to the current cath lab, and really what we want to focus on is the future state, not the current state. Right, a new medication administration safety process was implemented in a hospital. A team convened to perform a FMEA and calculate a risk priority number. After a targeted medication safety program on the new process was delivered to nurses, the same team was convened to perform another FMEA. The team would be happy to see A, the detectability increased and RPNs were lower, B, the detectability decreased and the RPNs were lower, C, the frequency numbers decreased and RPNs were higher, frequency numbers increased and RPNs were lower. All right, we're above 80% response rate now. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Majority of you indicated A. Let's see. We had a few folks pick some of the others, and we'll go through why. Those are not the best answer. So keep in mind, RPNs, you want, if they're pleased or happy, that would mean the RPN, risk priority number, would be lower. So we can eliminate C right away because the RPN was increased. B, if detectability decreased, then think about that. You would not be able to discern that there was an issue, and so you would anticipate risk increasing. So those two don't correlate very well. The detectability decreasing, you would anticipate the RPN would go up. So that's why that one's not right. And then D, frequency numbers increased and the RPN was lower. So again, if frequency of a failure mode increased, you would anticipate the RPN or the risk of that failure mode happening would increase. So that's why that one's not right. I think this is our last one. We'll see. Sharing of lessons learned from RCAs does what? It exposes the fallibility of the involved clinicians. B, allows others to introduce workarounds to avoid the same situation. C, allows coworkers to learn the rationale for why an event occurred and incorporate new lessons learned into practice. And D, sharing these events allows for exposure from litigation perspective and should not be encouraged. All right, almost everybody has responded, and everybody indicated C. So I think you understand this concept. Probably does not uh, does not need to be explained too much, but obviously we would not highlight fallibility of involved people. We keep them confidential. We would not reveal that. Um, Workarounds are not something that are encouraged, and then we do encourage sharing of lessons learned um, and information about the events. So we would not discourage that. We proceed to, there we go. Agenda for tomorrow.
Done, Sherry. That's such a content heavy module there, but congratulations everybody. We're done with day one. We've gotten through our 2 domains. We're going to pick it right back up tomorrow, same time, same place. Really appreciate the wonderful engagement today. It's been a really fun first day. Chrissy, any other administrative comments you'd like to make before we close?
Sure. Thanks so much for everyone attending today. Thank you for Sherry for this long module too. You did a great job. And thank you, John, for your moderation today. We'll see you back here same time tomorrow, 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. You'll use the same Zoom link that you accessed the webinar today. And thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.